All right. Red tail hawk. Actually, first, why is your name Red tail hawk?
It's a good starting point. Something happened to me in 2018 that I didn't really understand for a long time. I went over 52, almost 53 months before an unsought encounter with a Pascua Yaqui medicine man, 90 plus years old, happened to come my way. It was a remote encounter. He doesn't usually do that. He's, sort of scolded the lady whose interest in me drove her to offer the encounter. And I go through this more in some of what I want to talk about with you, but essentially he gave me my name, and in doing so helped me figure out what it was that happened to me at that point, again, almost 53 months prior. So
Huh. I'm glad I asked. Okay. You said he was. I'm not even going to try to pronounce what you just said.
Pascua, Pascua, Yaqui, Yaqui. The Yaqui,
Pascua Waki. Y. Oh,
A
okay.
Q
Pascua
U.
Waki. Am I familiar with them at all? Oh, yeah, Arizona. I wouldn't be familiar. Okay. Very interesting. Oh, okay. So they're almost in Mexico mostly.
Their lands, I think, traverse into Mexico somewhat. I think it crosses at least two U.S. states.
Oh, okay. And they speak Udo Aztecan related to the Shoshone, Comanche, Tohono O'odham. I'm familiar with the Tohono O'odham and of course the Hopi as well, which are okay, very cool. And the Tohono O'odham might be better known to some people as the Pima. I read a ethnography on the Pima at one point. Pima Tohono O'odham is I usually go with the indigenous names, but that can lack some clarity depending on how recognizable the name is. Okay, yeah, cool. So, what are you here to talk about? I mean, I know what you're here to talk about, but in your words.
Because of that encounter with Medicine Man, and as my name is 1923, that was the date that it happened. That was a date of significance for me. So it struck me in some really deep ways. And like I said, in my opinion, it was a solution to a 4+ year ongoing mystery. Imagine on a very stressful day, and mind you, not trying to, you know, I guess boost my ego or anything with this. I'm accomplished as an athlete. I've got state and national level medals in a sport in high school, and I've let's just say "don't tread on me" is, part of my lingo. So I'm not the type to drop in drop to the ground and, like, start rocking when it hits the fan, right? Like, I'm more the type to rise to the occasion. I'd like to have the ball with a few seconds left and down by one type of thing. So on this very stressful day back in 2018, I can tell you that in a moment of surrendering to the machinations of the universe, someone I loved was halfway across the country and a hurricane was rolling in town, and she had absolutely every reason to be completely depressed in that moment and potentially, like, passively, just let the hurricane take her anxieties away that day and forever, right? And I didn't want that to happen. And I had no ability to get across the country, fly or drive, and do anything about it. So I had to just surrender. And as I did, my entire body lit up with intense pins and needles. Like, if your foot falls asleep or something like that, but my entire body. And to go along with that, I remember I was driving at the time. I couldn't actually bend my fingers down. It hurt to try to do so, to try to grip the steering wheel. And I remember it lasted about 10 or 15 seconds. And right after it happened, and this is coming from, at the time, an open-minded agnostic leaning deist, perhaps. I remember screaming through the windshield and like, what do you want from me? Like I had literally just given up. So I don't know what this was supposed to be telling me, but whatever it was something. And I can't give it credit for being a panic attack because that's not how I am. Conflict, I don't try to seek it out, but I'm not going to shy away from it if it, pops up, kind of a thing, right? It's sort of a, was it virtue is couched between two vices, Aristotle kind of a thing, right? So yeah, that experience put me on a path seeking answers to questions that I had kind of given up in college. In college is when I kind of took a step back from the faith that my family had raised me with. And it wasn't that, and it was Roman Catholic. It wasn't that I was like against Jesus or any of his teachings or anything like that. It's just something didn't sit right with me about a lot of it. And I just wasn't sure after having been exposed to, especially like philosophy. Epistemological solipsism did a pretty good number on me, like the idea that I'm just alone in my own head and everything that exists is a projection of my own mind, and how I can't really prove anything other than that. And some stuff was pretty eye-opening, and I had to be honest about it and take a step back, so I did. But like whenever anybody would come to me and say, hey, do you want to come to my Hindu temple, or you want to come to my evangelical church or something, I would go. So yeah, after that event in 2018, I started going around to temples, trying to talk with people, get some answers. I studied Buddhism for a little while, but I never really found what I was looking for. Actually, I did, but I didn't identify it as being the thing that I had experienced. So
Yeah, it's quite common to not, for especially Western Buddhists. There's certain Buddhist sects that are more in line with identification with the religion, but it's there's a lack of like identifying as a ist, like a Christian or a Buddhist or a Muslim is much more of a Western Abrahamic idea, I think, in a lot of ways.
that's kind of where I'm at this point. And that's one of the things that I want to walk you through is like where I see all the different connections in all the various esoteric and religious wisdom traditions from this planet, and like weave a common thread through them all. And I mean, in doing so, I'm going to be highlighting that basically all of them have some amount of distortion and some amount of baggage to them, but they're all also fundamentally containing a core pointing at the same thing. And to me, that's big signal in a world of noise.
Okay, you're not about to. I assume that you're not about to explain to me why every religion is just treat your neighbor how you want to be treated.
I mean, they do all have a golden rule, but like, no, it's
Yeah.
this is going to tie into like the serpent symbolism that is everywhere.
Oh, okay. And now
It,
you
to,
have my attention. Well, you had my attention, but you have that's yeah, cool.
and to get to that point, I would also like to talk about ancient lost civilizations,
Okay.
ancient apocalypse cataclysm cycles, pole
Okay.
flip, and before I get into perhaps the some might consider doomy gloomy pole flip topic, a brief spin into reincarnation research from the University of Virginia that Graham mentioned in his Lex Friedman interview that dropped the same day that season 2 did
Hmm.
of Ancient Apocalypse.
Okay. Okay. Cool. Let's do that. I think I watched that whole interview. I don't remember that part, but that was at a time when I was watching all of the dozen or so that Graham did. One of them, mine, by the way, but that won't be out. Well, this episode won't be out for like a month. That episode with Graham Hancock will have already been posted for a while.
was going to say, I looked for that. I know you two met before you went on your vacation to a location of interest for this show.
Yeah. Hawaii was where I was. Yeah, and then I had a family issue, and I've been kind of out of it for about 3 weeks up until this week. But yeah, let's talk about it. Where do you want to start?
Well, I guess before getting into anything, it probably makes sense to offer a disclaimer on some of the stuff I'm going to talk about. You know, like you, I'm a walking content warning, so this is more for listeners than it is for you, because I know how you are. You're like me. You're open-minded but guarded by discernment. You know, some people are very closed-minded, and that's probably not your audience, but still, they're often very attached to certain ideas, and those people are often the architects and wardens of their own mental prisons. I'm still working on deeper verification of the ideas that I'm going to share through deeper research, but I'm reasonably confident in my overall cosmology. That confidence comes from studying a lot of different things and seeing how they all connect together. If we look at the famous Monty Hall problem from the Kevin Spacey movie 21, we can kind of extrapolate that to like belief sets at an ultimate level, where each possible combination of beliefs represents one door, and there's like a bazillion doors. It's most likely that during each of our lives, we were each taught something that was wrong by people who had our best intentions in mind as they taught what they thought was right. And that means that the first door we chose, so to speak, that was chosen for us, most likely didn't contain 100% correct ideas. Maybe it was 80% correct, maybe it was 90. Regardless, there are better doors out there with higher percentages of correct ideas contained therein. So the more we choose to substitute the ideas that we're holding on to for ideas that we have yet to sample, the more opportunities we give Monty Hall to expose bad idea sets or goats, right? It's a numbers game, like sales. The more phone calls you make, the more no's you get. And for every, 21 no's on average that a salesman gets, you might get one yes. And likewise, the ideas that we find, the more we are exposed to both good and bad ideas, and the more information we have to formulate our current belief set. So the closed-minded dogmatist is the one who most needs the lesson of the camel in the eye of the needle, and who needs the lesson of the empty teacup Zen koan. Some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about might ruffle feathers of dogmatists, right? Dogmatism is often a fawn response to survival situations as a kid. Kids realize they're better off not biting the hand that feeds them, so they fawn to their captors, their caretakers, as opposed to fight, flight, or freeze. This often leads to a blind adoption of the caretaker's cosmology without thorough examination of this cosmology for inconsistencies or flaws. And with that said, I would encourage everyone to love their parents for doing the absolute best they could as they attempted to inform us, to prepare us to deal with the challenges of this world. But at the same time, I would also encourage everyone to maintain an open mind, guarded by discernment, that is willing to challenge the teachings we were taught growing up, explore new ideas, and seek truth with a total willingness to relinquish previously held beliefs when presented with sufficiently compelling information. That's my little intro.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to find a lot of pushback from my audience, but yeah, absolutely.
You're my tribe, bird of my feather, no doubt. All right, so yeah, then before getting into the ancient apocalypse stuff and the lost civilization stuff and the serpent symbolism stuff, I think it would be most appropriate to start off by discussing a more spiritual topic that also has some basis in science: reincarnation. Like I said, I was happy to hear that Graham mentioned this research. I think he mentioned Dr. Ian Stevenson from the University of Virginia, who was originally the director and founder of their medical school's division of perceptual studies. He was succeeded by Dr. Jim Tucker. And I think a YouTube presentation by Dr. Tucker was my first exposure to it, but I have since read one of Dr. Stevenson's books. So the name of the book I read was Where Reincarnation and Biology Intersect, and it includes dozens of example case studies. And it's always a kid between the ages of 3 and 8 who report past life memories.
Okay, I remember this now.
Yeah, it was scientifically determined that for the first 7 years of a child's life, their brain is in a theta wave state. This is a programming state. Rapid learning takes place during this time. This is our get up to speed on how people live phase. It's like an on-ramp. Now, I said 3 to 8 years old, but I said 7 years on the theta waves. That's likely explained by age-keeping conventions. I know in some places newborns are said to be one, as in they are in their first year. This kind of seems odd to us at first because we don't call someone one until they've met and surpassed the 1 year mark. But on the other hand, we commonly refer to freshmen in medical school as first year med students. So we kind of have a basis for understanding that convention. So Dr. Stevenson is quite thorough in his work based on what I've read. He starts out discussing how powerful the mind is over the body by bringing up case studies of stigmata. And being the director of the medical school's division of perceptual studies, Dr. Stevenson was very aware of the kinds of tricks people's minds can play. And he kept that in mind when performing his research on all of these case studies. He's found plenty of cases that were bogus, but he's found thousands that he considers to be legit. And many of them have been quote unquote solved, which means that the child's previous life's personality is confirmed through various accumulated pieces of evidence.
Confirmed.
Yeah. Again, it's where biology intersects with reincarnation. So some of this stuff is pretty irrefutable. Like, this is perhaps a bit gory, but like, let's say somebody died in their past life. Somebody had a grudge against them. I don't know, they were adulterous or something, and you know how that kind of thing can go. And they wound up taking a butcher's knife to the chest 5 times or something. Like, if they are born with like 5 birthmarks, roughly the size of, you know, knife wounds in that exact area, and there's happens to be like medical documentation from the coroner's office on that past life, and it's all verifiable, like, there's lots of that in these books. And it's not just birthmarks, it's potentially some birth defects as well.
Wow. All right.
Obviously some birth defects are the results of, you know, drug use or I don't know, some diseases, I suppose, perhaps genetic things, but not all birth defects have known causes to science. So this would fill an unknown void. So,
okay, I would historically, or I would just, you know, pass up most of those birth defects from just likely random DNA, like his DNA is so complicated, but of course maybe it's even more complicated. So yeah, I mean, this podcast, man, I don't do a lot of pushback on here. I might do a little pushback for clarification, but yeah, that's interesting at the very least.
and these kids, they're never claiming to be Cleopatra or Lao Tzu or anything awesome like that. It's usually some rando pleb from a village that's half a city's ride away by like ox cart or something. And they were usually careful to avoid leading the witness to use courtroom parlance. They controlled variables like checking to see if the child's family had ever come into contact with the child's previous life's personality's family, or if there were any news headlines or what have you. As the title of the book suggests, like I said, the most fascinating aspect is how biology, or perhaps anatomy, and reincarnation intersect. He's noticed that it's birthmarks and birth defects that correspond oftentimes to wounds known to have been inflicted upon the previous life's personality's body.
So there's multiple like identifications of specific individuals.
Sometimes they're surgical wounds that, you know, were scars before death. Sometime there was one case where I guess relatives were aware of the idea that sometimes marks carried over, and I think they took lipstick and marked like a X on their deceased relative's back of his neck, and they wound up finding someone with an X-shaped birthmark or something like that happened in there. There's a bunch of case studies. It's so worth looking into. And actually, you know,
is this from Ian Stevenson or the other guy?
That was Ian Stevenson's book, but Dr. Tucker also has books out there. And like I said, he has inherited the directorship of that program and that research from Dr. Stevenson, who founded it.
I might have to. I gotta put you in contact with Nephilim Death Squad. Do you know those guys?
Mm-mm.
Yeah. I'm forgetting their names right now. Somehow. Yeah. You would like their stuff, and they might get something out of what you have to say. Why am I forgetting their names? Yeah, Top Lobster and David Corbo. Corbo, I think. Yeah, they're both Hispanic. I'm only saying that as I try to remember their names. But yeah, Top Lobster and David Corbo. Yeah, sorry,
Cool.
continue.
Yeah, I guess it's also perhaps currently relevant research because of one of many hot button political topics. They point out in their research that approximately 10% of their case studies are uh, switching from one gender to another. And that oftentimes, whether there is a gender switch or not in a reincarnation case, the child will often exhibit tendencies, preferences, behaviors of the previous personality. This might show itself in the form of a Japanese World War I soldier who died in Burma, who is reincarnated nearby, but shows a notable penchant for Japanese flavor palette as opposed to the Burmese flavor palette.
Hmm.
Things like that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's a lot of really interesting stuff in there.
What's
And
the difference in the Burmese and Japanese flavor palette?
honestly, you've got me. I remember that was one of the things that was mentioned in one of the case studies, but I
Yeah, no,
can't
I
say that I'm
assumed you
well.
wouldn't remember that. Yeah. My best friend's wife is Burmese. Well, she's ethnically Chinese, but like third gener she's American. She's a US Marine. She's American as hell. But she's Chinese ethnically, but her family lived three generations in Burma, Myanmar, whatever you want to call it. Very interesting. Yeah, so I love Burma. A lot of people don't even know it exists. I'm sure in my podcast listeners, more people know about Burma existing, but yeah. Okay.
So yeah, it's like one example of a birthmark or a birth defect, I suppose in this case. A boy lost his fingers in a fodder chopping machine in a previous life, and in the next life he was born with fingers that were severely malformed, underdeveloped, mangled, however you want to describe it. Another boy was born with just a stub for a right ear and an underdeveloped right side of his face. In his previous life, he was killed by a shotgun blast to the head. A
Good
number of
Lord.
cases, yeah. There's a lot of this kind of stuff in the book. It is a bit morbid, but at the same time, like I said, it's a bit of a white pill because, like, hey, cool, it's not the end if something bad happens to me.
Yeah,
I
but at
will
the same
respond.
time, you get something. It's supposed to be a fresh start. You get reincarnated in a new life, and you end up dealing with the crap from the last life. Although I guess that's also a point of reincarnation. It's just usually not so literal.
Yeah, there may be some sort of a karmic lesson that requires being learned after something like that. There's mind your P's and Q's, keep your head on a swivel. If you serve, you know what I'm talking about in that regard. Like, you watch your six, right? Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, there's a lot of stuff like that in there. Dozens of case studies are articulated in the book I read, so I can't really do it TLDR justice. I hope I have. Another difficult to ignore piece of evidence on this subject is past life regression hypnosis therapy, which was actually discovered on a US Navy base in Texas in 1969.
Yeah,
A
that's the
doctor,
time that a lot of this would have been done.
yep. A doctor on base was having trouble with a patient who was having an eating disorder. And so the doctor called in a Navy man on base and his wife, who had learned hypnosis from him. And the man who was suffering from the eating disorder while under hypnosis began responding as though he was a provocatively dressed and rebellious young woman from the 20s known as a flapper. So that was weird.
Oh God. Okay. Fantastic.
And
I
again,
would
if you
not be happy to know that I was a slut in my past life. That would be not fun. Or maybe
so
I would be happy. Depends on the context, I guess.
perhaps. So as I said earlier, it's known to science that the human brain is in a theta wave state for the first approximately 7 years. And we know that, like, sensory deprivation puts the brain into a theta wave state. I kind of think that's what like sarcophagi might have been used for as sensory deprivation chambers prior to being used for burial later on. Just a speculation on my part, because it would have been very resource efficient, right, if it was tailored to the individual. But yeah, a hypnotist will sort of change their tone of voice to be very calm, very soothing, very smooth, etc. Right? I have to imagine that hypnosis techniques, like, it affects the brainwave patterns of the hypnosis subject, and so certain techniques might produce different brain waves, including potentially theta waves. And so perhaps this past life regression hypnosis therapy is tapping into the same cosmic mechanism that seems to be present and aligned chronologically with UVA's research on the subject. So yeah, the wife of that Navy man who discovered past life regression hypnotherapy on that Navy base in '69 in Texas would go on to pioneer a lot of research in that area. And usually the past lives that she explores with her patients are kind of nothing burgers. They're mundane, but occasionally something extremely interesting would come up, like a past life where the person personally witnessed Jesus or was a student of Nostradamus or what have you. These people in their current incarnations typically were very ignorant of whatever subject it was that they were able to speak about with scholastic accuracy. And typically people are unaware of what they say while they're under hypnosis during these sessions. And so they have to listen to playback of audio recordings in order to know. And a lot of times they're really surprised by what they hear themselves saying. So yeah, YOLO, that is the idea that you only live once. Believers, you know, they may be surprised by this stuff. They may not like this information, but they should probably check out the research for themselves before throwing stones my way for talking about it. Obviously, for many people, being presented with the assertion that reincarnation is the truth means there are a number of other questions that would need to be answered. And I have a speculative narrative theory that fits as many facts as I know. So the obvious questions would be from adherents to the Abrahamic faiths, who tend to reject the doctrine of reincarnation, and specifically Christians, as reincarnation could be viewed as being in conflict with the concept of the resurrection. The short answers are that reincarnation does not conflict with the resurrection based on my understanding in cosmology. And the reason the Abrahamic faiths don't include reincarnation in a nutshell is Rome. It was not in Rome's interests for people to believe that they came back. People who come back are more likely to pull a William Wallace and go all Braveheart against the powers that be, which in this case would have been the Roman hegemons. So Giza Vermes, the first person to ever get a PhD in the subject of the Dead Sea Scrolls, said, quote, "The Dead Sea Scrolls have afforded for the first time direct insight into the creative literary-religious process at work within that variegated Judaism, which flourished during the last 2 centuries of quasi-national independence before the catastrophe of 70 CE forced the rabbinic successors of the Pharisees to attempt to create an orthodoxy by reducing dangerous multiplicity to a simple, tidy, and easily controllable unity." Dr. Vermes used this verbiage twice, once in the Dead Sea Scrolls 40 Years On from 1987, and again in the intro of the complete Dead Sea Scrolls in English from 1997. So he thought it important enough to reiterate.
We should say that that Judaism changed a lot from around the time of Jesus towards Rabbinic Judaism, which is a very, very different, non-arbitrarily different type of religion. So this was a very different type of faith at that point.
Yes.
I'm sure you know that, but just for the listeners, if they don't.
No, for sure. Rome's war on the Jews from like 66 to 70 AD was conceivably an ideal Roman opportunity to centralize that variegated Judaism into one tidy, centralized, controllable unity, as Vermes said. Likewise, I think it is reasonable to suggest that Rome's war on the Jewish people might have been, among other intended purposes, been initiated specifically to hijack Judaism through nefarious tactics like murder, bribery, etc., and ultimately gain control of the Jewish people by covertly controlling Jewish leaders.
Yeah,
likewise,
classic authoritarian stuff.
Right. It's cui bono, right, in a nutshell. That's a Roman playbook. So likewise, I don't think it's crazy to suggest that Rome hijacked the Christ movement, because again, Rome wanted authority to be centralized. They wanted to keep power for themselves, and consider that just maybe, like I said, the phrase cui bono wasn't just some random phrase that made its way through the centuries. Perhaps that was a significant governing credo of Roman hegemons. If we put ourselves into the perspective of the Roman hegemons and we ask ourselves, who is more controllable, people who believe you only live once or people who believe in respawning like it's a video game? Economically, if lifetimes are not scarce, people might not play it safe and cower to the power of the authority of Rome. It's like when Ace Ventura was climbing the cliff in the second movie, and he tells the helicopter pilot, "You can't stop me no matter who you are, or no matter who I am," right?
Huh. Yeah, and we should say that that's very common. Persia did this with Shia Islam. I was speaking to somebody, essentially creating or co-opting Shia Islam in response to Islamic expansion, replacing Zoroastrianism during the Arab expansion. And there's plenty of other examples. I mean, this happens all the time.
Nice. By the way, these comments, I oftentimes don't know a lot of your area, your scholastic efforts on these subjects are far, I'm guessing, greater in terms of tenure and depth. So all of my stuff is a lightning strike of my own interest, that what I've happened to be, searching through. So
yeah, well, you're saying a lot of things I don't know either. So it's, it's maybe not better or more. It's just different.
I love the validation, I guess is what I'm saying. I appreciate it. Steel manning. So yeah, the same past life regression pioneer who wrote about several of her clients who had past lives in which they were in contact with Jesus of Nazareth to various extents. In that work, as well as several other works, there are suggestions that Jesus traveled during the missing years of the canonical Bible. Jesus's teachings are extremely consistent with a number of different religious, cultural, and wisdom traditions, including Egypt, the Nagas from India, and the Druids. As it happens, after crucifying Jesus, centralizing that variegated Judaism into a neat, tidy, easily controllable unity, and wiping out the Essenes, who owned the Dead Sea Scrolls, Rome continued to do their best, in my opinion, my speculation, to try to wipe the tracks of Jesus's travels away through destruction as they expanded in conquest. Their conquest made its way up to the UK, where Jesus and Joseph of Arimathea likely traveled due to the UK being a rich source of tin, something Joseph traded with his fleets of ships, according to some of this reincarnation past life memory research. He would have known the Druids, being such a wealthy trader. As his relative, Joseph would have introduced Jesus to the Druids to learn from them. According to the past life regression hypnotist, Jesus traveled with Mary as a child to Egypt, where he likely would have learned about Kabbalah, among other Egyptian mystery teachings. The idea of Jesus traveling is corroborated by multiple other sources. One of them we'll get into later when we discuss pole flips in ancient lost civilizations and the linguistic connections there. So yeah, the main reason I wanted to get into the reincarnation stuff is, like I said, because the ancient apocalypse topic can be a little bit doomy gloomy. And so anyone listening, please don't fear death and don't be discouraged by the potential for cataclysms occurring within your or your loved one's lifetimes. Take a lesson from sports and play hard till the final whistle would be my advice on that.
Yeah, I think that's easier said than done, but that's all right. It's a good thought.
So I guess to kick off the ancient apocalypse discussion, I want to briefly discuss classification of documents by US intelligence agencies and the US military. I suppose they might classify nothing burgers, but I kind of doubt it. I've got 2 books about this topic that were once classified. One book is called World in Peril by Ken White, which is about the origin, mission, and scientific findings of the 46th/72nd Reconnaissance Squadron of the U.S. Air Force.
Wait, I'm sorry. What was that unit?
The 46th/72nd Reconnaissance Squadron of the U.S. Air Force. Yeah, that book, the other book is that was formerly classified is called The Adam and Eve Story by Chan Thomas, a polymath engineer who worked for a major aerospace contractor and as an engineer was assigned by that contractor to work on ARPA projects. That's the Advanced Research Project Agency, formerly, that's the name that they had before it became DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, which means that Thomas was working on like super top secret research projects and had top clearances prior to 1972 when ARPA became DARPA. And if anybody's ever seen the movie Expendables 3 with UFC legend Ronda Rousey, among other stars, one of the characters is a DARPA soldier and he has all the really cool toys. So I should point out that the YouTube channel, The Y-Files, did an episode on Chan Thomas and his book, and in my opinion, failed to assess the book properly. The host's articulation of the pole shift mechanism betrayed his lack of understanding, and their coverage of Thomas's book, while decent and mostly accurate, failed to acknowledge that World in Peril even exists, let alone the fact that it corroborates Thomas's work. Other stuff corroborates Thomas's work too, but classified US Air Force documents are perhaps the least controversial. I should also point out that Graham recently began executive producing a series online called the Forbidden Book Club, and Chan Thomas's Adam and Eve story was the first episode of that new series.
Yeah, I think I've heard him discuss that before.
Mm-hmm. So you've got the Wright brothers, World War I, couple of decades of refinement in aviation technology, Air Forces, World War II dogfights, then boom, war's over and it's 1945. So now what, right? According to Ken White's book, World in Peril, and this is, again, specifically chapters 27 through 30 are the ones that are of interest to anyone looking this up. And again, it's an expensive book. It's probably $400 plus in print, and I'll offer you a PDF of it. If you want to share it in some way, shape, or form, you're welcome to do so. But yeah, if people want to have access to it.
Well, I can't if it's under copyright.
Oh, okay. I mean, I have shared it, so if it's
right. No, I mean,
I'm in trouble.
That's probably fine, but I can't share it like in an official capacity to a large audience.
Gotcha.
I mean, if it's under copyright, which it would be if it's from that time, I think it would have to be prior to 1921, or some other rules to be out of it.
Fair enough. So the Air Force, they started doing some avionic exploration of the magnetic North Pole and noticed some wonky compass readings. They found out that there wasn't just one magnetic North Pole, but rather three within an area the size of Montana. One pole was determined to be the primary pole on the northwestern shore of Prince of Wales Island at that time. The other two poles apparently formed the foci of the elliptical region. One was located on Bathurst Island and the other on Boothia Peninsula. On October 19th of 1947, the US Air Force announced the finding of the three magnetic North Poles. And not long after that, a Canadian ground expedition produced extremely similar findings. In 1831 is when the first observations of the magnetic North Pole were made, and the location of the magnetic North Pole remained relatively static on Boothia Peninsula until 1945, 114 years. This discovery that the pole was on the northwestern shore of Prince Wales Island meant that the magnetic pole had moved 165 miles closer to the geographic North Pole. They concluded that the movement of the magnetic North Pole was unpredictable, but it had been moving clearly in a north-northwesterly direction. This led to many scientists asking a rather obvious question: what happens when the magnetic North Pole moves to coincide with the geographic North Pole? And to answer this, the Rand Corporation studied models of the Earth constructed out of concentric spheres. There was an inner sphere representing the electromagnetically charged molten iron core of the Earth, whose axis defined the magnetic poles, and an outer sphere representing the crust of the Earth, which rotated around a geographic polar axis. It was determined through repeated experimentation that as the magnetic pole approached the geographic pole, the magnetic pole would at some point accelerate its rate of convergence as though pulled towards the geographic pole by centripetal or center-seeking force and jump to coincide. But instead of the poles coinciding, the magnetic pole would rapidly flip around the geographic pole, then spin off towards the equator as though by centrifugal or center-fleeing force, ending up at a position where the two axes assumed an approximate 89-degree divergence. So the poles flipped to the equator. After this polar flip occurred, the axes would then gradually begin to reconverge over a long period of time. So one might ask, what's the significance of this? Well, there are a number of mysteries on Earth begging answers. So let's go through a number of them. And again, I would encourage people to look these things up as I go through them. Starting off, why are there high strata of mountain rock containing marine fossils? That's weird. Why have beaches of sand formed from ocean wave action at 1,500 foot high altitudes in the mountains of Italy? Observations from around the globe show that almost all of the land areas of the Earth have been glaciated at some point in the past, including parts of Africa, India, and South America that are presently located on or near the equator. If global temperatures dropped to levels sufficient to glaciate even the equator at some time in the past, all life on Earth would have been destroyed. If, however, Africa, India, and South America, which are presently located in tropical locales, were ever located in a geographic polar region and later shifted to their present locations, the evidence of glaciation in these locations is not at all mysterious. Spitsbergen is an island well within the Arctic Circle that is now snow and icebound most of the year, yet there's ample evidence that tropical corals once grew on the shores of the island. Spitsbergen also has considerable coal deposits that attest to the island's once temperate or tropical climate. Water lily fossils have been found there embedded in lignite, also confirming the island once had a warm and marshy environment. Perhaps the best piece of evidence from Spitsbergen is the prehistoric frozen trees unearthed there that have no rings. Rings occur in trees due to seasons. So for a tree to have no rings, it must have grown in a location where there are no seasons. And there's only one place on Earth that has no seasons, the equator. So it stands to reason that at some point in time, Spitsbergen was at or near the equator. There's two possible explanations for this. Either the whole Earth was once much warmer than it is now, but even still, wouldn't it have seasons? Or the poles were previously in different locations relative to the Earth's crust. So you have a coral reef that's on the floor of the Arctic Ocean, staying on that same vein, right? Yeah. You have Admiral Byrd's 1933 to 1935 expedition that found leaf stem imprints and fossilized wood under the snow and ice. And Sir Ernest Shackleton found coal beds within 200 miles of the geographic South Pole, evidence of a massive primeval forestation in Antarctica. And massive forestation does not occur in places where there are 6 months of darkness every year.
No, it does not.
Also found near the South Pole were the fossilized footprints of a prehistoric mammal-like reptile. Since reptiles are known to be cold-blooded and need the warmth of the environment to sustain their body heat, it is evident that the Antarctic did not always have a cold climate. If this is true, again, either the entire Earth had to be much warmer than it is now, and again, the seasons would still be in effect, or Antarctica must not have always been located at the geographic South Pole. So then you have the New Siberian Islands, located about 200 miles off the northern coast of Siberia. They're almost literally composed of the bones and remains of multitudes of prehistoric mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant beavers the size of goats, prehistoric rhinoceros, buffalo,
I would love
deer.
to see a beaver the size of a goat. That is
Right.
awesome.
Right, that needs to be a meme. Like, was it
Absolutely.
horse-sized ducks versus duck-sized horse?
Yeah, yeah. That's an old one. I love that. Okay.
So yeah, they found all these like mammals and whatnot, and like how could so many of these animals that were also found throughout Siberia and Alaska be frozen intact within the ground in such a way that 10,000 years later, their flesh, when thawed, was said to be edible? At one Russian scientist's banquet at the
Tell me they
Moscow,
didn't. Oh, no.
yeah, they ate mammoth steaks in the 1930s, Moscow Academy of Sciences.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And they were apparently quite delicious, according to reports. Another question is how the frozen tundra of northern Siberia and Alaska would have supported such large populations of prehistoric mammals unless the Earth once had a much warmer climate, or the Arctic was previously not located near the geographic North Pole. Perhaps the most noted of the thousands found was the Beresovka mammoth, that's Beresovka, found near the Beresovka River in northern Siberia. It had a pink skull due to hemorrhaging in the head, along with an erection, which shows that it suffocated to death in the surrounding homogeneous muck.
Yeah, I've heard of this one.
Biologist Ivan T. Sanderson approached this discovery from a frozen foods vantage point. When you freeze meat, the problem is to freeze it fast enough so the moisture content contained in the meat doesn't have time to form large crystals while freezing. The faster the freeze, the smaller the crystals. If you freeze the meat too slowly, the moisture will form crystals large enough to destroy the fibrous structure of the meat, which, when defrosted, will be nothing more than a mess of goo unfit to eat or cook. So the larger the piece of meat to be frozen, the more difficult it is to freeze it fast enough. This Beresovka mammoth was several tons when it was discovered in 1901 by Russian scientists. They recorded that even the innermost lining of the stomach had a perfectly preserved fibrous structure, indicating that his body heat had been removed by some super prodigious process in nature. The American Frozen Foods Institute was consulted, and weeks later they concluded it was impossible with all their engineering and scientific knowledge. Furthermore, they looked to nature and concluded there was no known process that could accomplish the feat. The American Frozen Foods Institute did say that the temperature would have had to have been lowered by about 140 degrees Fahrenheit or 78 centigrade from its normal temperature. And it must be accomplished in an absolute outside time limit of approximately 4 hours. But in reality, it needed to be more like 2 hours or less. And the Institute didn't account for two factors. First, it wasn't just the Beresovka mammoth that was being frozen. It was the entire strata of muck that the mammoth suffocated in that was having heat removed by this same process. Second, mammoth's erection, which was also frozen, which tells us that the entire strata of the outer portions of the mammoth were frozen in about 1 minute, possibly less. So another couple of points of interest about the Beresovka mammoth, the fact that one foreleg, some ribs, and its pelvis were fractured. Consider how strong a mammoth's leg bones and pelvic bone would have to be in order to support the weight of a body that weighs several tons. Also, the mammoth was found with frozen buttercups in its mouth, indicating that something extremely violent and rapid happened to it while it was eating some food.
So you're cutting out, Cleveland.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm losing your picture as well. The volume was still okay for a little while, but now you're.
It may have been my furnace was going on. I can go flip it off. And
no, I think it's I don't think it's the furnace. I think it's the internet.
Oh, well, the furnace might be interrupting the internet Wi-Fi with the hot air stratifying in the same zone. So I'll flip it up either way. It'll take 3 seconds here. Off. All right. I got a hoodie on anyways. In honor of Jack Mahler's going on to pool show.
All right, we should be okay. The picture's not great, but as long as the volume's okay, it's not a problem.
Okay. So I guess sticking to the topic of megafauna, we've got footprints of dinosaurs imprinted in beds of exposed river mud that got frozen, like the Beresovka mammoth, before prints could deteriorate, remaining frozen and preserved for thousands of years to allow the mud to ossify for us to see as dinosaur footprints in rock beds today, kind of like white sands, I guess, to some extent, right?
Right. New Mexico. It's a site that's talked about in Ancient Apocalypse Season 2. You all should watch it and give it double thumbs up on Netflix, please.
100%. Amazing program. Another curiosity of Earth is the apparent uninterrupted evolution on the Galapagos Islands over the last 1,000 years. Punctuated equilibrium is the idea that we typically see discontinuities in the evolutionary pattern for each species with clear epochs distinguished by particular characteristics. For example, the New Siberian Islands I talked about earlier had goat-sized beavers, yet now that's not a thing. So something drastic happened to the global beaver population at one point. Specifically, both the Malay Peninsula and the Galapagos are of interest to us, as both are now both rife with lizard life. There are some huge granite blocks sitting on the eastern slopes of the Jura Mountains. And it is well known that the Jura Mountains are non-granitic, and whatever granite exists in those mountains is still buried deep in them. So these huge granitic blocks have been traced to the Swiss Alps across the Swiss Valley to the southeast, 50 to 80 miles away. What's really crazy is that these blocks sit at an altitude equivalent to the source altitude. Swiss geologist Arnold Escher von der Linth and German geologists Leopold von Buch, among others, determined that fast-moving water could have done this, but their work was dismissed because people couldn't fathom how water would move that fast. So I have a few speculations to add. We often see buildings being unearthed, and people suggest that these buildings were chiseled out of the surrounding stone. I think this cataclysm mechanism does a better job of explaining those buildings when keeping stratigraphy in mind. The strata in, for example, the walls of the Grand Canyon show remarkable homogeneity within each strata, not only in terms of the properties of the earth that composes each strata, but also in terms of the vintage of each species found within that strata from a punctuated equilibrium perspective. It seems far more likely that these buildings were created long ago and were buried under successive layers of flood silt that over the course of many years ossified into stone that tightly hugged each curve and corner of the once above ground extravagant display of architectural mastery. Then there are the legends and the myths. In Tierra del Fuego, at the southern tip of South America, a primitive man tells the story of the day the sun set in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
In Peru,
when you say primitive man, I'm sure you're quoting something.
Yeah, that's pretty much right out of Chan Thomas. Most of the
Okay,
stuff
yeah.
is I pulled from Chan Thomas or from World in Peril. Nothing but respect, obviously, for indigenous people, given
I understand.
the relationship I have with them, with my name and whatnot. That
Yeah.
forever endeared to me for that reason. I love all people. So yeah, then you have in Peru, again, primitive man tells the story of the day the sun stood still. Then you've got Malayan and Sumatran legends from tribal aborigines of what they call, quote unquote, the long night. And of course, there are the linguistic curiosities, like the similarity of languages the world over, from the family of Polynesian tongues to Greek to Egyptian to Mayan to Yakut to the Oriental family of languages and more. So what could explain all of this? Well, a good solution to any mystery answers all of the facts available. And the Socratic method would suggest that a few definitions would be helpful before I dive into the hypothesis. So first, we live on a 60-mile thick, approximately, layer of Earth we call the crust, known to science as the lithosphere or the rock sphere, right? Beneath that is another 60-mile thick layer of semi-plastic molten rock called the asthenosphere. It's ASTHENO sphere. Material in the asthenosphere will yield to persistent stresses. And shortly before World War II, geophysicists discovered a method of determining the location of rocks on the Earth's surface at the time they were formed relative to the North Magnetic Pole, beginning the study known as paleomagnetism, which produced some puzzling results. This new science showed that the magnetic North Pole had changed its location by thousands and even tens of thousands of miles, hundreds of times during the Earth's geological history. This meant one of two conclusions for scientists had to be true. Either the Earth's axis of rotation must have changed, which everyone found to be highly unlikely, or the crust drifts over time. This is where the theory of continental drift arose. But
okay.
Scientists postulated that the lithosphere floated on the asthenosphere, and as the lithosphere drifted, the surface area that is located at the Earth's axis of rotation, so at the geographic north and south poles, does not remain the same over long periods of time. They believe this accounted for the apparent wandering of the poles. But continental drift, I mean, it could explain some of the curiosities I mentioned above, like the tropical life forms located within the Arctic Circle, the ringless frozen prehistoric trees of Spitsbergen, even evidence of glaciation at equatorial latitudes, but it doesn't explain a lot of other things. As I said above, a good solution to any mystery must answer all of the relevant facts. So continental drift as a theory is unsatisfactory from that vantage point. If we revisit the experimentation done by the Rand Corporation in the late 1940s, I mentioned earlier, we recall that it was determined through repeated experimentation that as the magnetic pole approaches the geographic pole, the magnetic pole would at some point accelerate its rate of convergence as though pulled towards the geographic pole by centripetal force, jump to coincide, then flip rapidly around the geographic pole, then spin off towards the equator to a roughly 89, 90 degree divergence in the axes. And the word rapid offers us a concept that's very different from drift. Continental drift takes place on the order of low single digit quantities of centimeters per year. That's extremely slow. But what if some massive force acted upon the Earth's crust and caused it to slip very fast? I'm not talking about asteroids or meteors, although I allow that those are things that have happened and deserve a place in this conversation. I'm not going to be commenting on them at all. We know the Earth is not dynamically balanced with respect to the distribution of mass on the surface. Rough computations from decades ago said that roughly 486 quintillion, it's 486 followed by 18 zeros, ton miles of torque, not foot pounds. These are big units, ton miles. Tending to
486.
Yes, 486 quintillion, and that's again out of Chan Thomas's book.
What the heck?
So that much torque is tending to rotate the lithosphere. And again, ton miles are big units. It's usually measured in foot pounds.
What can we compare that to? Is it 486 quintillion ton
miles?
Ton miles?
Yes. I think 1 ton mile might be like 10 million foot pounds or something like that. I'm not sure. I think that's the case.
I mean, I don't even know where to begin on that. So we're just going to say that that's an unfathomable number, essentially.
Yeah.
That's like biblical or levels of power.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. That's a lot of Tesla Cybertrucks.
That's God level power.
Yeah.
That's what people would have referred to if they witnessed this as God acting, like an act of God.
I mean, I feel like even if I saw that today, it would be God acting. We don't have anything that makes that. Good Lord. Okay.
So if there's that much of a torque imbalance on Earth's crust, why doesn't the crust shift? There's two main forces that keep the Earth's lithosphere in place. The first one we've sort of discussed already. The semi-plastic asthenosphere layer underneath serves as a sort of glue, keeping the lithosphere from drifting rapidly. The other force is the magnetic coupling of magnetic portions of the lithosphere to the iron outer core. There's a sort of sheet in our galaxy that we call a polarization sheet. It's responsible for the polarization of our galactic neighborhood, if you will. And occasionally that current sheet has a ripple or a null space in it. And these waves are tens of light years in periodic length. Whenever this periodic ripple hits our neighborhood, it impacts the polarization of the planets in our system. This is what's happening to other planets in our solar system right now. We're being impacted by one of the waves from this galactic current sheet. As I pointed out above, in the 1940s, the US Air Force noticed that the magnetic North Pole had begun to move rapidly compared to over 100 years of relative location stability on Boothia Peninsula. I find it very hard to believe that this polar wander occurrence is merely coincidental with our solar system being impacted by this galactic current sheet. And it only makes sense that a ripple in the polarization sheet of our entire galaxy would impact our magnetic poles and our magnetosphere. Concurrent with the poles wandering, the strength of the magnetosphere is reduced. Over the last 150 years, scientists have noticed a weakening of the magnetosphere by 5 to 10%. There's also the South Atlantic magnetic anomaly, which seems to be growing in size. So you have the fact that the Earth's core has recently reversed spin as well. The core, being the source of Earth's magnetosphere, would logically be impacted by significant variations in the local polarization of space due to a periodic wave of the galactic current sheet. So when the Earth's magnetosphere is sufficiently weakened, the molecular structure of the asthenosphere may be temporarily modified, meaning like, okay, so Swedish physicist Hannes Alfvén, his work suggests this, that the asthenosphere is typically a semi-plastic layer of molten rock that serves almost like a molasses layer, like glue, that helps hold the crust in place, but without adequate magnetic field strength around it, running through it, right, interpenetrating it, the structure of that molten rock may change. You think about how water's structure changes when it becomes ice, and again, when it melts back into water, ice doesn't flow as well as water does. It's like the viscosity, there's a significant difference there. Likewise, the asthenosphere's molten rock may flow much better when the magnetosphere strength is severely reduced. Alfvén did this with, I think, mercury and like a spinning rod thing, like a cylinder that he spun, and he induced magnetic fields around it and was able to see that under different magnetic field conditions, the shock waves of disturbing the mercury in the container were either absorbed or not absorbed. And were, by not absorbed, I mean transmitted through the mercury to the top layer, where like a mirror, a scratched mirror, was resting on top of it, and there was a light shining on it, so you could clearly see the mirror's reflection if it moved, based on the fact that you were pivoting this the cylinder inside of it, this handle thing. So yeah, when the Earth's magnetosphere is sufficiently weakened, the molecular structure of the asthenosphere may be temporarily modified, like I said. And when that happens, the 486 quintillion ton miles of torque exerted by Earth's unevenly distributed surface land masses causes the North Polar ice cap, and probably Greenland and all the crust that it's on, to want to get gyroscopically mediated out to the equator. Same thing with Antarctica in the opposite direction. Think about how Olympic figure skaters change the speed of their spins by centralizing or decentralizing their arm and leg mass. So with that much torque acting on the lithosphere, the entire shift could take half a day, possibly a quarter of a day. So this may explain then like the concentration of flood debris with the North Siberian islands, right? And all those animal bones that are there. This means that 2 points that are currently on the equator will shift up to the geographic poles or shift down to the South Pole. It also means that there will be 2 equatorial pivot points that remain at the equator before and after the event. Evidence of an uninterrupted string of evolution on the Malay Peninsula and the Galapagos Islands suggests that those may have been equatorial pivot points of the last pole flood.
When you say equatorial pivot points, what does that mean?
So,
like, wouldn't it be the entire Earth shifting? What's specific about that?
So if you think about the ice caps moving to the equators, to the equator rather, then you would have points that previously were on the equator on the same geodesic that it's rotating, right? That would then flip.
And when I've heard about pole shifts in the past, usually it's a shift and then a shift back quite quickly. Is this a situation where it's a shift and then staying there for a while and then shifting?
Yeah, where you shift into a new configuration. So like the Mayan calendar, the end of the world as we know it, like a new configuration of the continents on Earth, a new set of shorelines. Yeah, it's pretty much a reshuffling of the deck once
Is
every
there a
roughly 6 to 7,000 years or so.
6 to 7 thousand years? That's it? Is not every 6 to 7 thousand years? Is that what this is saying? Every 6 to 7 thousand years?
Yep, and there are
That doesn't
events.
make sense to me.
There are
I
events
mean,
going
fine,
back
but
on the timeline. Jimmy Corsetti went on Rogan recently and gave a shout out to Sun Weatherman on X. He's definitely worth following and checking out his research on the
I've had
subject.
people bring him up to me all the time. I'm not as interested in this type of thing, so I haven't. But I've seen that.
I've seen a list of different cataclysmic events that seem to be pretty in line with that 6 to 7,000 year range.
Right.
And honestly, with like the, you know, the precession of Earth's axis of rotation being what 25,772 years long,
Yeah.
if we divide that into quarters, we get 6,443 years, which is right smack dab in the middle of that 6 to 7,000 year range. And if we think about like sinusoidal waves, there's really 4 important points of interest within each wave cycle: the high, the low, and the 2 points where the wave crosses the midline. So looking at it from like a calculus vantage point, either the first derivative or the second derivative of the wave function changes at each of those quarter points. So those are significant changes, and I can imagine that those sort of cosmic mile markers may be the points in the wave, like the current sheet, the galactic current sheet, where the pole flips occur. So it's almost like a chain driving a gear on a bicycle to me, that like that current sheet is the chain, and then the precession of our axis is almost the gear being impacted by it. So this hypothesis obviously accounts for a number of the curiosities I mentioned already, like glaciation at equatorial latitudes, evidence of tropical life in polar regions, etc. We still have to explain the granite blocks of the Jura Mountains, the New Siberian Islands, the Beresovka Mammoth, and more. So we should probably dive into that, right? So envision the Earth. Its circumference at the equator is 24,901 miles. And a person standing on the equator travels that far every 24 hours, meaning that that equatorial ring around the Earth is moving at roughly 1,037 miles per hour, which is well beyond supersonic. Atmospheric air, lakes, oceans, and land located at the equator all move at that speed. For reference, even at a 45-degree latitude, north or south, the Earth is still moving faster than 730 miles per hour. And for reference, supersonic speed is 768. So North America, I think our border with Canada is the 48th parallel. So almost the entirety of the contiguous 48 would be in the supersonic speed range. So if the asthenosphere ceases to serve in an adhesive capacity and temporarily shifts into lubricant mode, and the 486 quintillion ton miles of torque act on the Earth's crust, the tectonic plates will get dragged roughly 90 degrees with the mass of the ice caps of the now former poles getting gyroscopically mediated to roughly the equator. So what about the water and the atmospheric air, though, that's been just trucking all around, just like clockwork, right? Those fluids have momentum. They're used to rotating around the Earth at supersonic speeds at mostly habitable latitudes along with the land, but because of the land, water, and air, they're all moving together, we don't experience the incredible force of supersonic winds or waters. Our perspective as surface dwellers is relative to the surface which is moving. So now imagine you took a baking sheet from your kitchen and you created a reasonably accurate topographical model of Earth's surface out of sand or dirt or whatever. You shaped continents and mountain ranges and whatnot, and you filled in the rest of the baking pan with water to model the oceans. Now imagine that baking sheet was on an airport travelator, those horizontal moving walkways. But imagine that this particular travelator has a random 45-degree offset in course at a certain point, and then at 45 straight again. as the baking pan scale topographical model of Earth's land and water, it traverses that 45-degree turn, you will notice some cataclysmic sloshing of the water in that pan.
Yeah.
The model's ocean water will slosh violently across your modeled lands. Scale-sized observers on that model would experience incredibly tall waves that completely inundate the lands, flooding everything, wiping out most life, most structures, most signs of civilization, etc. Lots of evidence, archaeological evidence. Now imagine being on Earth observing this event happening. The oceans would completely inundate the lands worldwide. Survivors would speak of great flood events like Noah's Ark and the story of Utnapishtim and the Epic of Gilgamesh. 99% of life on the planet would be wiped out. Survivors of each species would become the new prototype of the species, leading to the observed leaps of evolution from one epoch to the next. So this offers a reasonable explanation for punctuated equilibrium. Waters would sweep away across all the lands from west to east, picking up tons of topsoil, animals, and whatnot in a supersonic rampage. Anyone who's ever seen the aftermath of a flood may have noticed patterned concentration of flood debris. This explains the composition of the New Siberian Islands, made up of almost entirely of mammoth, buffalo, deer, horse, saber-toothed cat, etc. remnants. Like, those islands were formed due to a concentration of flood debris in one of these cataclysmic events, most likely. The Beresovka mammoth probably got swept up in one of these events. The broken foreleg and pelvic bone demonstrate extreme levels of force and violence, like 1,000-mile-per-hour, 2-mile-high tidal wave floods. It may not have been the water that broke its leg and pelvis. It may have been what the water was pushing, right? The mammoth was likely living in a temperate or tropical zone that was shifted to a polar zone during the cataclysmic shift, hence the rapid freezing. And if the Beresovka mammoth got hit with something the size of the multi-ton granite blocks we found in the Jura Mountains, who knows how badly its body could have been damaged. But those multi-ton granite blocks from the Juras could have been relocated from their point of origin in the Swiss Alps 50 to 80 miles across the Swiss Valley if 1,000-mile-per-hour floodwaters torrented across the land. Bear in mind that 1 foot of water moving at 20 miles per hour can move a car. And honestly, less water than that can sweep a car away. So this is potentially, 30 to 50 times worse than that in terms of water speed alone. I don't even know how to reasonably estimate how much worse it would be than a foot of moving water. You're talking about multiple mile-high waves and stuff here.
Mile-high waves.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
So
Jeez.
if someone suggests, I don't have any calculations to back up that. It's just, dead reckoning hip shot estimation based on.
Yeah, well, it's such a extreme calculation.
So if someone suggested that the tidal wave, let's see, if the tidal waves could be that size, I'd consider that to be in the range of reality. I don't know, I want to say that it's not out of the question, especially perhaps in a place like South America, where if the ocean's coming from the west to the east and you have that huge elevation change right away, to me, that's like a giant skateboard and a ramp to ollie off of. You imagine that throwing water up high? Oh my goodness, that would be nuts. So then, of course, you have the legends of the long night, the day the sun stood still, and the day the sun set backwards. So you imagine living through one of these cataclysms, right? Thousands, possibly tens of thousands of years ago. Imagine the place where you're able to take shelter from the ongoing chaos affords you a view of the sun on that day. For your entire life, you've watched the sun progress from east to west in the sky, but on this day, because of the chaos that's going on, your location on the Earth shifts, generally east to west as well, let's say. Could be west to east, but let's just say it's east to west for these stories. Depending on the speed of the crust shift and depending on how long it's been since sunrise, it could appear as if the sun began moving in the opposite direction and actually set in the east. And at some point after that, the crust shift would stop and eventually the sun would rise again in the east and resume normalcy, right? So alternatively, if the speed of the crust shift was able to keep pace with Earth's rotational speed, but like in the opposite direction, it could appear as if the sun stood still. And so like if your survival location is radially far enough away from the equatorial pivot point, that speed might match really, really nicely. And so it could appear that the sun is standing still to you.
Okay. Okay. And in different parts, it would either look like it's moving very quickly or backwards,
Right.
based
And
on the relativity of the location relative to the sun.
exactly. And likewise, if the sun had not yet risen for you in your survival location and survivors experienced an east to west shift, that would extend their night and explain the legend of the long night.
Yeah. Yeah. In a location where it's not normal, like Norway or something, for there to be a very long night.
Right. And I would tend to guess that like more survivors would exist closer to the equatorial pivot points, because you're pivoting at like, you know, the inner ring of the record playing on the record player is moving at technically a slower linear speed than the ring at the outside of the record on the record player. They're moving at the same rotational velocity, but not the same linear velocity. And so I think a reduced linear velocity might come with perhaps less cataclysmic, chaotic violence and whatnot. So it wouldn't shock me. And equatorial latitudes tend to be where people live anyways because of the easier conditions there are for, you know, food production and not having to worry about dying by cold and whatnot. So it makes sense to me that there would be stories from closer to those latitudes. That just makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Of course, it's not just supersonic, mile-high walls of water ripping across the lands that cause the devastation. There's also the atmosphere, like the ocean waters. The atmosphere has rotational momentum, so the air is going to be blowing just as fast as the water is inundating the lands. We're also talking about tectonic plates moving here, not just the edge between two plates, but every plate on the planet. There's gonna be earthquakes galore. Chasms can open up 60 miles deep, allowing the asthenosphere below to get squeezed up and out of the chasm, melting bedrock, altering topography, like the formation at Mexican Hat out in Utah. Chan Thomas went into that pretty extensively in his book. The seismic activity would undoubtedly cause volcanoes to pop off, spewing lava, ash, and gases into the environment. The tectonic plates smashing up against each other would form new trenches and mountain ranges. Entire continents could rise out of the ocean or fall below sea level, depending on how the cookie crumbles. As if the initial supersonic inundation of ocean water onto lands wasn't enough, the tectonic plates slipping against each other underseas would cause tsunamis, causing more massive waves. The fact that the ice caps have shifted to the equator means that there are now massive chunks of ice located at the equator. The direct heat of the sun would immediately go to work melting all that ice. The surrounding relatively warm ocean water will also begin melting the ice cap. That ice melting will have effects on ocean currents and Earth's weather in general. All sorts of storms would be expected. It would pretty much be a free-for-all. You'd have an intense fog for the first day or two that envelops probably the entire equatorial region due to the ice caps melting. It would be so bad that nobody would be able to see the moon or the stars. Maybe after another day, the moon might be bright enough to be visible through the fog. Maybe not the stars another day. Maybe the stars would
There's
be
so much
visible again.
sediment in the atmosphere that it blocks out the sun and the star, or the stars and the moon. Wow. All right.
Well, I'm thinking fog, just because the ice caps at the equator zone, like that it would lower temperatures below the dew point and saturate the air with moisture, and I think that it would band the tropical zone.
Okay.
And I think that is partially corroborated by Genesis 1, which I'm going to offer you a retranslation of that is perhaps not a creation story, but in fact a 7-day regenesis story following one of these cataclysms in what it describes.
Okay. I'm
so
still here.
Yeah, a huge homogeneous layer of flood silt would have been deposited across vast areas of land, bearing any buildings that withstood the cataclysmic violence, right? You mix in with that layer of flood silt would be the seeds of the plants that got swept up in the inundation. After a few days, there would be sprouts starting to pop up out of the silt layer. Surviving humans and other animals would be hungry after hunkering down for several days. They might have noticed some seedlings sprouting up, and other animals out and about, as that would have been the only thing available to forage in this situation. So from here, we can probably pivot to Genesis, but not to talk about Noah's Ark, although that cataclysm mechanism I just described is most likely what caused Noah's flood, in my opinion. We have to pivot to Genesis to talk about the 7-day creation story, right? But science tells us that the Earth is over 4 billion years old. So there's that sticking point, that classic sticking point that a lot of people have issues with. So if we break down the Genesis creation story into bullet points, we kind of get the following. In the beginning, the earth was without form and void, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Within the first day, there was light, but initially there was darkness. Within the second day, it focuses on the establishment of firmament, aka land versus water. It talks about waters that were above the land and below oceans, right? Day 3 is a continuation of day 2 insofar as the establishment of shorelines is concerned. And on that same day, seedlings started sprouting. Day 4, there were lights in the heavens to divide day from night. There was the greater light, the sun that ruled the day, and the lesser night, the moon that ruled the night. The stars and signs are mentioned as well as tools useful for tracking astrological signs and seasons. Day 5, the creatures of the earth became present, including birds, fish, and land creatures alike. Day 6 seems to be suggesting the living representatives of each type of species, from man to cattle to every creeping thing and beast of the earth, would have descendants, quote unquote, after his kind. So we move to Genesis 2 for day 7, where it says the heavens and earth were finished, and on the 7th day, God rested. Genesis 2 also says, quote, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. In the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, and every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. For the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground, but there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground, end quote. So if we look at that information that was shared in this story and ask if in any way it aligns with the picture of what a survivor of a geomagnetic excursion-induced cataclysm might have experienced. So you imagine being a survivor on one of these cataclysms, imagine seeing the sun set backwards, or imagine having a 16-hour long night, or imagine witnessing the sun stand still in the sky as far as you could tell amidst the chaos and terror of the event. If the sun went backwards or you were experiencing the legendary long night, you might anxiously wonder, is the sun broken somehow? And, like, is all life on Earth about to go extinct? We kind of need that. That's big. Once the Earth settled into its new, shell orientation, and a new day dawned on your location at its likely new latitude, might seem like a cause for celebration, so much so that one might even name a day of the week in honor of the sun coming back into a regular rotation as it once had before the cataclysm. And as Genesis 2 pointed out, there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. If we understand that the polar ice caps just melted and caused that big mist that I was suggesting that banded the earth, that might explain, that bit of Genesis. Mist forms similar to how fog forms. Air cools to the dew point. Relative humidity is 100% roughly. Air becomes moisture saturated with temperatures cooling to the dew point, which is roughly 55 degrees in like the HVAC industry. So
yeah.
that's what, 13 Celsius or whatever. So, for reference, on the size of the Antarctic ice cap, it's growing at a rate of approximately 1 Lake Ontario per year. That's a lot of pent up, freezing cold, fresh water that will be melting very rapidly. So that would, I think, reasonably have a significant impact on Earth's weather patterns for at least a few days.
Mm-hmm.
So when all of a sudden you have massive chunks of 32-degree ice and ice melt water immediately around it getting hit with direct sunlight for 12 hours a day, you're going to get conducive conditions for mist formation. Talking about big chess pieces, right? The sun and polar ice caps here. So you imagine that when one of these crush, shift, pull, flip cataclysm things occurs, There'd be 2 pivot points at the current equator, right, that would become part of the new equator. You imagine that the survival rate might be higher at those pivot points. So you might have survivors passing down these stories, and they might have likely been in the equatorial region that got misted by those melted ice caps spoken of in Genesis 2. So that might be why we had witnesses. If there's a massive foggy, hazy mist, any astronomer knows you're going to have a hard time seeing anything like the moon or the stars, which would have been known by survivors of any such cataclysms of the past. Perhaps the sun's brightness was enough to penetrate the mist on the first day after the cataclysm, but maybe the moon and the stars were not bright enough, and then maybe the next day the moon was visible, so that becomes moon day, right? Maybe after a day or two of tidal waves and tsunamis and earthquakes and volcanic activity and hurricanes and tornadoes and all sorts of dangerous weather patterns, the tectonic plates would have settled into their new places. The earthquakes would have mostly stopped, meaning tsunamic and volcanic activity would also have mostly stopped. The initial inundation floodwaters would have had a day or two to recede, allowing shorelines to form and allowing seedlings to sprout atop the layer of flood silt left behind by the receding waters. Once the weather calms down and seedlings started to sprout, any surviving animals would probably be pretty hungry, like I said before, and thirsty. After several days of hunkering down, come outside, get some nourishment, fulfill those biological needs. And of course, all of these things were the way it was before, with oceans and land being separated by shorelines, with the sun, moon, and stars, plants and animals. But to someone experiencing this cataclysm, they might have thought they were experiencing the end of the world and all they knew. So while the world they knew did change, it did not change completely. In the eyes of the survivors, things would in some ways return to normalcy insofar as they still needed to work to eat, get water, clothing, shelter, etc. And the same resources that were available before the cataclysm would still be available after the cataclysm. Some survivors might have characterized this quasi-return to normalcy by saying things, once again were, quote, as God intended, end quote, right? Since that's the way it was before. We ate seeds, fruits, vegetables, had dominion over the other animals, etc. before, and we do again now. So Chan Thomas, it seems, studied Augustus Le Plongeon and James Churchward. One of James Churchward's big contributions was the linking of the ancient Naga glyphs from Northeast India with the glyphs of ancient Mayans. According to Churchward, the Naga glyphs are identical to the Mayan glyphs. They are the same glyph language, which is kind of huge.
You said Mayan and Indian? Is that Indus River Valley?
Mayan, like Western Hemisphere, like ancient Mayan. Not even the modern Mayans, but the ancients.
Right. And then, but what was the other one in India?
The Nagas in the northeastern portion of India. Not too far from Tibet, I guess. So if those are the same language, that's a pretty important fact that I am going to circle back to when it comes to talking about ancient lost civilizations and other etymological oddities. So if we look at the concepts that are present in the Adam and Eve story itself, things like tree, fruit, serpent, cherubim, word of fire, and other words used by Moses, according to Churchward, it's evident that the 7-day creation story and the Adam and Eve story were both originally written in this Naga Mayan glyph language, given the glyphs that exist within these languages, right? So it makes one naturally wonder, what Naga Mayan glyphs would Genesis have originally been written in order for us today to have gotten the English that we got? And if we were to reverse engineer that original form, here's a translation of that creation story according to Chan Thomas, based upon the work of James Churchward. It reads, "In the beginning, the universe was created in God's great design. Included was our sun and our planet Earth. And during one of the many cataclysms that occurred during the Earth's history, The earth's lands were all inundated with raging waters and ravaged by horrendous winds, and the oceans were all dark with muddiness. And the ill wind thundered over the troubled waters also. And as the storms abated, sunlight came back to the face of the earth as God intended. And while the cataclysm was abating, once more darkness and sunlight were reestablished and distinguishable, and it was good. And sunlight was again daytime, and darkness again nighttime, in accordance with God's design, and evening and morning made one day. Again, God's original design was that there would be a sky between the clouds and oceans. And in accordance with God's design, the heavens were reestablished, in that the sky again stood between the clouds and the oceans, as the onslaught of the great cataclysm abated. And God's heavens were indeed reestablished, and that evening and morning were the beginning of the second day. And God's design was that the lands would not be entirely covered by the oceans, as they were immediately following a cataclysm. So the disrupted oceans, now settling, drained off the higher lands. And in accordance with God's design, the dry land was earth and the waters ocean, and once again it was reestablished and good, as God intended. And since God's design was that the earth should bring forth grass and herbs, yielding their seed, and the fruit yielding fruit containing its seed, and the earth was again reestablished. Therefore, the earth being reestablished brought forth grass and herbs yielding their seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit containing its seed. And it was good as God intended. And the evening and the morning were the start of the third day. In accordance with God's design, there were normally lights in the heavens, which served to indicate months and seasons and days and years. Also, they served to furnish light on the earth as God intended. And as the great fog lifted and the clouds broke, the sun and the moon reappeared, and also the stars. And once again, as God intended, they shone from the heavens, and the sun and the moon were able to divide light and darkness, which was good. And the evening and the morning were the start of the fourth day. And it was God's will that some of every creature living and birds flying should survive the cataclysmic inundation. Surviving then were the great whales and every living creature of the sea and every kind of winged fowl, and it was as God intended and good. And they were blessed with God's original design to be fruitful and reproduce and replenish the oceans with sea life and the air with fowl. And the evening and the morning were the start of the fifth day. And it was God's will that some of every creature, cattle, and creeping thing and beast of the earth should survive the cataclysmic inundation. Surviving then were the beasts, the cattle, and every thing that creeps on the earth. And it was as God intended and good. And in accordance with God's design, man, who was created in the image God intended, also was to survive and have dominion over the fowl of the air and over the cattle and over the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So it was God's design that man, who was created in the image God intended, both male and female, would survive the cataclysmic inundation. And they were blessed with God's original design to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and control it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God's design was that man, being given every herb bearing seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree, in which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To man it should be for food, and to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, wherein there is life. God's design was that green herbs shall serve for food, and it was as God intended, and everything which survived was as God had originally created, and still was in God's design, and was good. And the evening and the morning were the beginning of the sixth day. That's the end of Genesis 1 as retranslated via the Naga Mayan language. I want to finish off the 7-day creation story real quick by reading the first few lines of Genesis 2 as translated via that same language. So continuing, thus the heavens and the earth were reestablished, all the host of them, and on the seventh day the recovery from the cataclysmic flood were complete. And the seventh day brought rest from the fight for survival against the cataclysm and its after effects. And the seventh day brought God's blessed peace as the cataclysm had abated, leaving those of his creation who survived. So yeah, the quote unquote 7-day creation story seems to potentially be more of a 7-day regenesis story of what it was like witnessing the Earth go through its reset process after one of these periodic pole flip crust shifting cataclysms.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that makes sense. Given that, you know, the Earth, I believe the Earth is billions of years old. That makes sense to me. So, I've never thought about this before. Okay.
It explains a number of things, including like ice ages and stuff, right? When the polar ice caps flip out to the equator, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's a localized ice age for that area.
Right, right, right. A quick one though, or no, not even quick, because it would be in this theory 6,000 or so years old.
Right. The melting of the ice caps would be fairly rapid, and you would have new ice caps forming at the geographic poles again. So there would be some period of transition there that might impact global shoreline levels, you know, ocean levels and stuff. But I think the big flood thing is the water sloshing over the land when the crust shifts. To me, that makes the most sense, and from an Occam's razor vantage point, explains so many curiosities on Earth. Right, we went through
Yeah.
those. So
Okay, so where are we going from here?
this gets us right into the lost civilization stuff. One that you and Graham recently visited in your travels, according to this hypothesis, or
Mm-hmm.
remnants of it. So if we keep with that Naga Mayan language connection, you know, we quickly find ourselves in a conversation about the ancient lost civilizations. So let's take a look at the Greek alphabet. According to Chan Thomas, and I think he got this from Churchword, the Greek alphabet as we pronounce it today is the colloquial slang pronunciations of the letters from approximately the time of Euclid. Prior to that, they said that the letters were pronounced differently. They said it seems that if one were to read off the old pronunciations of the Greek 24-letter alphabet in front of anyone who speaks any of the Polynesian family of languages, that person might recognize something intelligible being spoken, as if each letter is in fact a word. So those ancient pronunciations are, I'll do the modern and the old. So alpha is alpa aha, beta is beta, gamma is gamma, delta is telta, epsilon is epsilonum, zeta is zeta, eta is eta, theta is thethehaha, thethehaha, emphasis on that first ha. Iota is iota, kappa is kappa'a, lambda is lambeta, mu is mu, and that's a clue as to where we're taking this conversation, which lost civilization we're pursuing here. It's mu. Then you have nu, which was ni, like perhaps the knights who say ni, I wonder. Xi, 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 xi. The old pronunciation was xi. Omicron is omikleon. Pi is pi. Rho is laho. You have sigma was ziikma. Tau is tahoe, which makes me think of the car, Tahoe. Upsilon is upazileon. 3 emphases on different syllables there. Phi, like the golden ratio, I guess. Pei high. Chi or ki, chi is pronounced kai, and psi is pei zai. Then omega was omeka. So the translation of the Greek alphabet's old pronunciation, when translated through that Naga Mayan parent language, like we did with Genesis, into English, yields the following: overwhelmingly break the oceans, they inundate the lands, Mother Earth receives the deep. Where obstructions are, shores form, mighty winds rampage. Where, with oceans piling over oceans, they bury all that is living and moving. Where hills are, they vanish, buried, submerged with the earth of the motherland. Mountain peaks alone stand forth before the onslaught on our planet, which abates little by little, until there comes the cold wind. The motherland is now at the bottom of the earth, an abyss, a vast reservoir of frozen mud. There comes out of volcanoes vapors pouring forth with swirling smoke and molten lava. I should point out that the last sentence of the first half of the translation reads, again, quote, "Where hills are, they vanish, buried, submerged with the earth of the motherland," end quote. So the last letter from the first half of this 24-letter alphabet is the 12th letter, mu, meaning mu is the word motherland. So we're going to keep that in mind for later, right? Based upon this translation, it seems that thousands upon thousands of years ago, our human ancestors survived one of these cyclical global cataclysms. The event was so impactful, one trauma response at a species level was the echoing of the story of the cataclysm down through time via what we now know as the alphabet, our building blocks for creating the words we use to label things and communicate. It's kind of major. Interestingly, in the Buddhist and Hindu religions of the Eastern Hemisphere, the word Maya itself refers to an illusory veil of labels through which we see the world and interact with it. It's like we're all just stardust. Everything is stardust, but we give it labels, and that separates things from its underlying unity. And yet there was an actual civilization of people known as the Maya. So the same word shows up in completely separate hemispheres and in ancient ways. According to Churchward, the Naga glyph language of northeastern India, again, is an exact match for the ancient Mayan glyph language from the Americas, which begs a number of questions, like how did people on completely different hemispheres from a really long time ago wind up operating with the same glyph language, for starters? That's probably the biggest. Then another one is, it's not just Maya that's the only etymological curiosity that spans the hemispheres. The Nagas, again, were from northeastern India, yet in the Western Hemisphere, home of the Mayan people, there's the tradition of Nagualism, as well as the word Nagual and the language called Nahuatl. So you've got Nagualism, Nagual, and Nahuatl, which all sound very close etymologically and phonetically speaking to the word Naga, in my opinion. So how do these words have connections like that? How do these ancient groups separated by the largest ocean on Earth have the same glyph language? Well, according to Churchward, mu, the word he uses to refer to the motherland of this lost civilization, is the name of the place where the great Nakal, N-A-C-A-A-L, parent civilization of mankind, was rooted and flourished. Churchward suggests that based on legends from the Americas and from Asia, that there was once a great continent in the Pacific Ocean from which many colonies sprang a long time ago. He says there are legends from the Americas of the motherland Mu to the west. From what I've heard, the Mount Shasta area seems to tie into this. You've got, it's like that may have been a colony of Mu in North America. Legends of a mountain with some tunnels in it, perhaps affording shelter to survivors of the cataclysm that wiped out the motherland, exist in relation to Mount Shasta, if I recall correctly, and that would make some sense. Like tunnels in a mountain, that'd be a pretty good place to bunker for this type of disaster, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, according to another source, this great continent sank beneath ocean level during a tectonic plate shifting inundation approximately 50,000 to 53,000 years ago through no fault of their own. And this is in agreement with Churchward, who says Mu existed approximately 50,000 years ago. So Churchward said that the disparate island of Rapa Nui, Easter Island, featured on season 2 of Ancient Apocalypse, the Hawaiian Islands and Fiji were all once part of this now lost motherland continent known to the Nakal people as Mu. These islands are perhaps remnants of that continent, possibly volcanic mountains that grew high enough to protrude from the water when the rest of the continental shelf had remained sunken at much lower elevation below water level. And if that's true, it's possible that you and Graham both visited some of the remnants of one of those lost civilizations that he's been chasing. And so I would be very curious to see what a scientific canvassing of the Pacific Ocean's floor between those island regions would yield. However, if it did yield little to nothing, I would still reserve judgment because, again, according to multiple sources, Mu went under about 50,000 years ago. And these pole flip events happen once every 6,000 to 7,000 years or so. So this deck of cards has been reshuffled a few times since then. So these cataclysms could have destroyed a lot of evidence of the Nakal civilization in the motherland of Mu, if it did in fact exist. And of course, being underwater for thousands of years, subjected to ocean currents, etc., that's bound to have a significant impact on how much, if any, evidence of such an ancient massive parent civilization remains. Augustus Leplongeon and James Churchward suggest that Mu was a global civilization with colonies in South America, North America, again, like at Mount Shasta, the Uyghurs, the Nagas, Egyptians.
Which Uyghurs?
Of
Sorry, just because there's modern Uyghurs and there's ancient Uyghurs, and there's not necessarily continuity between them. Just what time period does that reference come from?
I'm going to guess ancient Uyghurs on that.
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
okay.
I'm honestly just now diving into Churchward's books after having figured out that those were some of Chan Thomas's sources, trying to check my sources and everything. So, but yeah, that seems to think that the Uyghurs, the Nagas, the Egyptians, the Persians, these were all potentially colonies of Mu long ago. But after the cataclysm wiped out that global civilization, not just the continent, but obviously the whole world, survivors in each colony were divided and isolated in their respective locations. I'm guessing any seafaring vessels were no longer seaworthy, so sea travel was brought to a halt, and every surviving colony kind of had to make do and start fresh where they were without the benefit of their global civilization supply chain, similar to what we have today. So there was a legendary land to the south of India known as Kumari Kandam, which is said to have been inundated by the ocean, sunken, similar to Mu. Scientists have been confused as to why lemurs were native to India and Madagascar, but nowhere else in between. They hypothesize that there may have been a now sunken land bridge, which I want to say Madame Blavatsky called Lemuria. I heard somewhere that she coined that term in honor of lemurs, that lemurs lived on, that was connected to India and Madagascar. It may have also been connected to Australia as well.
It says here zoologist Philip Sclater. Huh.
Came up with that term first.
Yeah.
Entirely possible.
Okay. I've never heard of this. Well, no, I've heard of Lemuria, but I didn't know where it was proposed to be. Interesting. Okay.
Churchward and Leplongeon suggested that the Nakal people of Mu had many colonies, like I said, including India and Egypt. So assuming Kumari Kandam, or Lemuria as it is sometimes called, indeed existed at the same time that the continent of Mu existed before it went down, it stands to reason that the Nakal people likely colonized at least parts of that landmass. And so Lemuria or Kumari Kandam may have been one part of a much larger global network of colonies centered about the motherland continent in the South Pacific that they called Mu. That this Mu motherland theory would also explain why so many languages have so many similarities. This Naga Mayan parent language of mankind echoes on in scattered remnants in the Polynesian family of languages: Greek, Yakut, Egyptian, Eskimo tongues, nomadic, Oriental tongues, Germanic tongues, and Native American languages, just about all languages, according to Chan Thomas and, like I said, his sources. So that gets us kind of into the serpent symbolism topic, pivoting from the Naga Mayan language actually to Jesus's dying words on the cross, which is kind of an interesting bit. And that gets us into one people who are known as the serpent people, who we've been talking about, the Nagas. So if you want to get into that, I think Jesus spoke that Naga Mayan language with his final words on the cross. Again, this is Chan Thomas and potentially his sources where this is coming from. But if you look, Matthew, Mark, and John all have accounts of this in their Gospels. John's the least specific and most presumptuous, assuming Jesus said, "I thirst," likely because someone thinking Jesus was thirsty from the crowd put vinegar on a sponge and put the sponge on a reed and lifted the sponge to Jesus's mouth. Now, whether or not Jesus was thirsty is somewhat irrelevant, as what Jesus said likely had nothing to do with thirst. In Matthew 27:46, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani." That is to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" End quote. Mark 15:34 says, quote, "Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which is being interpreted, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" End quote. Matthew and Mark spell the first repeated word differently, with Matthew spelling it Eli and Mark spelling it Eloi. Someone in the crowd said, "Hey, he's calling Elias," which is our best tiebreaker. If we had to pick which spelling, Matthew's Eli or Mark's Eloi is more accurate to what Jesus said. Given the phonetic resemblance of the first two syllables of Elias to Eli, we should probably lean toward Matthew's Eli as being more accurate. Matthew did speak Aramaic and Hebrew. If it was Greek or Egyptian or any of the known languages from that area of the world, someone would have been able to figure out what it was, but they couldn't. So they had to sound it out as best they could. Their own writings suggest that these were best guesses. Both Matthew and Mark put question marks after these statements, along with qualifying remarks like, "that is to say," or "which is being interpreted." This tells us they didn't know for sure what Jesus said. And if we look to the Naga Mayan language, we find a phonetic match that makes a lot more sense given the circumstances of the storyline when the words were uttered. It's Heli, Heli, that's Heli, Lamat, Lamat, Sabak, Sabac, Ta, it's Ta, Ni, Ni. It's Heli, Heli, Lamat, Sabachthani, and that sounds really similar to Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. So it means, I am fainting, darkness is overcoming me. Well, that's kind of appropriate for someone who's about to die, especially when you consider, like, crucifixion was pretty torturous on the lungs. And, like, you had to support your body weight. It was a form of asphyxiation. They didn't oftentimes use nails. Sometimes they did, I guess, but like usually it had to do with asphyxiation, right? Mm-hmm. So we know from the canonical Bible that Jesus had an interest in discussing matters of religion, philosophy, cosmology, law, Torah, etc., with teachers and rabbis at the temple growing up. There's a lack of content describing what happened to Jesus during the missing years from around when he was 12 years old and when his parents found him in the temple, forward until when he returned to Jerusalem, not long before he would wind up being crucified, not to mention missing chapters from the childhood, right? We have very early and then we have missing chunks. And so according to my research, Jesus traveled all over during those missing years. Multiple sources suggest this. As I said before, one source says Jesus traveled with his mega wealthy elder male relative Joseph of Arimathea, who again was a tin trader, owned fleets of trade ships, and had contacts in the UK where there's a lot of tin. The UK has legends about Joseph of Arimathea and Mary and some of the disciples winding up in the UK, and I believe the Catholic Church even admits that the very first brick and mortar Christian church is in the UK and was built by Joseph of Arimathea and those surviving disciples. So if
not
Jesus
Ethiopia?
No.
Okay.
I know the Ethiopian people have the Ark, as Graham's research suggests, right? So I know that's an important site.
Seems to be so, but yes, and very, very early churches. Okay.
So if Jesus had a penchant for discussing such topics with the learned people from his locale, it's not hard to imagine that he would have gone to talk with the Druids in the UK. Likewise, Egypt isn't too much of a journey, so he would have at some point gone down there to learn some Egyptian wisdom. According to my research, he did that as a child with his mother. during one of those missing chapters. Remember that in ancient Egypt, there's a ton of serpent symbolism, as there is in many places, as we know, and for good cause, including Matthew 10:16, where Jesus said, "Be ye wise as serpents and harmless as doves" to the disciples. So following that serpent concept leads us right back to the Nagas, who are known as the serpent people. It's most likely that during some of the missing years, like I said, Jesus traveled the Silk Road, making his way as far east as Ayodhya in India, formerly known as Ajudhya, where there was a Nakal temple. According to church word, again, Nakal is the name of the people who lived on the Mu Motherland continent. There's likely the etymological source of your Naga, Nagwal, Nagwal, and Nahuatl. So if Jesus traveled to India and studied with the Nakals, as he'd likely done with the Druids and Egyptians, it's likely he learned the Naga language in order to study with the Nagas too. And speaking bluntly, anyone paying attention to Jesus' teachings, as well as the teachings of the Nagas, would know that no legitimate student of the Nagas, including Jesus, would ever have said of God, "Why have you forsaken me?" And my understanding of God is that God interpenetrates every subatomic bit of existence. God is in everything, including the very matter that we are each made out of. It's not possible for God to forsake us. God's existence interpenetrates our own existence. And that gets us knee deep in the serpent symbolism topic. So I'd like to lead into the serpent symbolism with a little bit of science first. So when current flows through a straight or coiled wire, magnetic fields are induced. This is how electromagnets work, right? You're also made of atoms with electrons orbiting them, right? And your electrons may not be moving in as ordered of a manner as electrons composing current flowing along a copper wire are, but they're still the same charged particles and they're still moving. It's known to science that the human body has an energy signature that can be suppressed by Faraday cage lined clothing. There's even a company with whom I have no affiliation that sells what they call human energy concealment or HEX suits. According to this company, scientists know that the reason deer are so easily startled by hunters, despite the fact that they're wearing, 4 kinds of camo and scent blocker, is that you're a light bulb to them. They have this flavoprotein in their eyes they call cryptochrome, which means hidden color. And scientists have found this in bird and sea turtle eyes too. This flavoprotein affords these species magnetosensitivity or magnetoreception, which is the ability to visually perceive magnetic fields. In the 1990s, scientists performed a laboratory experiment with 3 test subjects who were administered measured doses of the psychedelic drug commonly known as LSD. The test subjects were placed in a completely dark room along with a pair of large horseshoe magnets rotating at half a hertz. Each participant reported seeing diffuse blobs of white, purplish, or greenish yellow lights as the magnets rotated. The experiences were not reported while the magnets were stationary or removed from the apparatus. There may be an association between these results and von Reichenbach's possible ergot-induced perceptions of quote-unquote magnetic light from the 1800s.
Right, ergot being a fungus, I think, that grows on spoiled crops. It's associated with a number of different things, including the witch trials, but yeah, continue.
So if we think about who are the most likely people to tell us they can see people's auras, I think it's fair to suggest that hippies are going to be near the top.
Okay.
If
All
I
right.
had to, I love hippies. I'm something of a hippie myself, so no shade there thrown. But if I had to pick one pony for that bet, I'm going with hippies. And hippies like LSD and other psychedelics, and indigenous traditions also make use of various psychedelics. So this is where we can get a little bit into my story briefly, which, like I already explained a little bit about my name, but I think that the medicine man who gave me my name, when he gave me my name, what I did is this: I sent a picture of my hand doing the how, greeting with my fingers extended but together. That was it. He saw a picture of my hand, and he gave me a name that, number one, solved a 52 plus, almost 53 month mystery. And we'd never said a word to one another. We've never been in the same room, never shaken his hand before. So it is, in my opinion, that according to the Qigong tradition, the hands have a Qi energy center. Like it's Shen Men is the name at the wrist, Lao Gong is in the center of the palm, and then Zhong Kui at the inside of the topmost knuckle joint of the middle finger. I'm going to suggest that Lao Gong and Zhong Kui are flowing Qi, and it's that Qi that was causing that wheel that I showed you. That's when you followed me the first time, was when I showed you my hand moving that wheel telekinetically. I was essentially using that energy body, that magnetic aura, to affect that wheel and make it spin. And by the way, I'm an HVAC and energy engineer in the mechanical industry.
Okay.
So
I was going to bring this up earlier, but I used to be an HVAC technician.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
So if Medicine Man, 90 plus years old, had unlocked magnetoreceptive vision through various psychedelic practices and was able to view my hand's energy centers, he could potentially read, assess, and qualify my aura, my energy body. And upon seeing my energy body via these energy centers, he gave me a name that is given to people that have that type of aura going on. And what he was able to see was essentially that a good spirit was always with me. An online friend of mine who I met in a small, little known libertarian internet community based around a small, little known libertarian YouTube channel was my connection to Medicine Man.
What channel is that, if you don't mind?
It's Liberty Land.
Okay. Yeah.
Honestly, I just went there to orange pill people. I wanted to get people on board with Bitcoin. I figured libertarians were a good group of people that appreciate honey badger money.
Yeah.
So I'd never even actually seen any of their videos before I went there. But one woman there like developed a sufficient interest in me over a year or so of shared conversation, and she's had some pretty adventurous chapters in her life. She's partied with bands I can guarantee you've heard on the radio. She's been to fancy parties in Hollywood. No Diddy stuff, though. She's an extremely kind and good-hearted person. So. I say these things to convey a sense of the types of A-list people she's been around, backstage at concerts or even at celebrity parties. And after a couple days of researching what it means for a person to be given this name, honestly, a cocktail of emotions welled up in me. Like I said, I waited almost 53 months to figure out what the hell happened to me in 2018. And I asked my friend if Medicine Man routinely gave out names like that, because based on my research, it was a name that carries a lot of honor with it. And she agreed with my assessment of the name and said that she was kind of in awe of me, which that really hit me given what she's experienced going to like celebrity parties and going backstage at A-list concerts and stuff. So like at one point she referred to me as a holy man, which is something I wouldn't have said of myself. And so why do they consider me a holy man, and how does the name Red-tailed Hawk fit in, and how does any of this tie back into serpent symbolism? Well, if we've accepted that the human aura is real and can perhaps be understood by the right-hand rules of electromagnetism and is scientifically verifiable as the human energy signature, and if we're looking to ancient energy healing traditions like Qigong or Reiki or pranic healing, then it would make sense to learn about and define the various anatomical aspects of that energy body or that spirit body or whatever you want to call it, subtle body. We can look at the Chinese terms, the lower, the middle, and the upper dantian, which are descriptors of portions of our chi body, our energy body. This nomenclature maps onto other traditions' nomenclature, such as the Hindu tradition, where they talk about the 7 chakras, with the root chakra being located at the perineum near the sex organs. This is co-located with the Hui Yin energy center, according to the Chinese Qigong nomenclature. It's not just the 7 chakras, though. The Hindu tradition, like the Qigong and Reiki tradition, recognizes that the energy body has secondary or tertiary energy centers, located in the palms, feet, major joints, etc. There are pathways through which prana or chi may flow. The Hindu term for these pathways is nadi, or nadis, plural. Above the root chakra is the sacral chakra. Above that's the solar plexus, which has to do with self-awareness and ego. Above that is the heart chakra, which has to do with love. Above that's the throat chakra, known as the wisdom chakra, which has to do with truth. Above that is the third eye chakra, co-located with the pineal gland, represented by the pine cone on the caduceus symbol. On that symbol, the two snakes crisscrossing represent Ida and Pingala. It's IDA and PINGALA, which are two of the three primary nadis or pathways for prana or chi or whatever to flow between the chakras up and down. Then you have the central staff of the caduceus symbol that represents Sushumna, the central straightaway nadi that again connects all the chakras. According to the rishis of India, Sushumna, that central straightaway represented by the staff on the caduceus, is not typically used to conduct the flow of prana or chi or whatever. And by the way, prana, chi, that's ki in Reiki. It's ruach or ruach in Hebrew. I don't know how to say it. The Greeks called it the etheric. Tesla called them scalar waves. And of course, the people of Rapa Nui, as Graham mentioned out in season 2, call it mana. So every tradition...
Right. That's broadly Polynesian, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, and of course, if they were all from Mu, as the theory states, then that would make even more sense, right? And every tradition seems to have a term for this, whether it's spirit, soul, or whatever. So I might weave interchangeably between these names at times, but I'll probably stick mostly to like prana or chi. So according to the rishis, Sushumna, it has, in special circumstances, gets used. It's used when higher chakras are activated. It said we have 3 chakras activated: the root, the sacral, and the solar plexus chakra. As such, we're at a fork in the road, spiritually speaking, and we must choose a path. There's the dark side path, which is to act totally in service to one's own self, ideally at the expense of others. People like Rasputin or Genghis Khan were notorious examples of this type of polarization. And this cosmic incentive for such a choice of polarization is the activation of the throat or wisdom chakra by skipping over the heart chakra. This is where the trope of the evil genius comes from. I can circle back to genius being related to this more in some etymology in a little bit. Those on the negative polarization path essentially zero out the heart chakra. Jesus, Buddha, and many others throughout history have polarized positively and taught us how to polarize positively too, which activates the heart chakra. That's why they're all teaching like the golden rule, like you said. Whenever a chakra is activated, it is referred to in the Hindu tradition as Kundalini awakening. Kundalini Shakti, S-H-A-K-T-I, and Kundalini is K-U-N-D-A-L-I-N-I. Kundalini Shakti is the name given by the rishis to a special bit of prana they saw with their magnetoreceptive vision, likely due to using psychedelics. It's coiled up like a serpent. And they said it's coiled up 3.5 times, which is really specific. And leads me to think that they're not just making things up, because like, again, that's really, really specific. And it's wrapped up around the root chakra. They noticed that whenever a person activates a chakra that was previously dormant, that special unit of prana that they call Kundalini Shakti, shaped like a serpent, rises up through Sushumna, the central nadi, to the height of whatever the highest chakra is that's being activated. And this is why the Egyptians wore little serpent headdress belt things that made it look like a serpent was coming out of their third eye. The Egyptians were descendants of Mu, just like the Nagas and the Mayans alike, according to Churchward and Plongeon and whatnot. So they all had these common teachings. The wings of the caduceus represent enlightenment. The feather is a symbol of lightness, lighter than a feather, lighter than air, even though that isn't exactly true. Then you have the idea that wings are suggestive of an elevated perspective and perhaps positioning as a liaison between the heavens, the skies, and the earth. Essentially, if we envision each of the 7 chakras as being one of the 7 colors of the rainbow, one who has activated all 7 chakras has achieved the Tibetan rainbow body. And if you merge all 7 colors of the rainbow, that's essentially white light, which is indicative of enlightenment. Other occult concepts that echo this are the word like Illuminati, which essentially means the illuminated, another way of saying enlightened. From the study of Kabbalah, which was Egyptian again long before Moses brought it to the Hebrew tradition, Keter, the top sephira on the tree of life, is known by many names, many of which include some reference to brilliant white light. Sufi mystics use the term nur to refer to such divine enlightenment.
Sufi, I just want to explain a few of those. The Tree of Life is very important to ancient Celtic traditions and a few others, and the Sufis are a group of Muslim mystics.
Agreed. Thank you. And so these are just a few examples of great reverence paid by various traditions to the idea of light, right? Even we're recording this on a Friday the 13th. That's the Templar Day, right? In my opinion, the Templar cross bears resemblance to a photograph scientists recently were able to take of a photon. And if you consider that the Holy Grail was a vessel suitable to carry divine blood, and you consider the ideas of like hermetic alchemy, transmutation, the process of finding the Holy Grail may very well be the process of becoming the Holy Grail and becoming a vessel suitable to carry divine or enlightened blood. And so the fact that it's a red photon, blood is a liquid, it conforms to the shape of its container. So that might explain a photon-shaped, blood-filled vessel Templar cross. But I think it may have been some type of, like Ramanujan figured out that formula in a dream or whatever, like some Templar may have had a dream of, where they saw the light and they saw it in a photon shape, and they decided that, that would make a good symbol of enlightenment or of their order, and they filled it with blood for that reason. They filled it with the color red to represent the divine blood. So, I don't know. So that's just a speculation on my part, though.
Okay.
So from seemingly every corner of the earth, we see the symbol of predator birds, raptors, depicted clutching a serpent in its talons. This is the reason why it's symbolic of enlightenment, of wisdom, of love, of activating higher chakras, of ascension, of salvation, of being born again. There's a ton of great etymology to dive into on this. So let's talk about the serpent hieroglyph in Egypt. If you type words like Jehuti, Banabjedet, Wadjet, and Jed into a hieroglyph translator, you'll always get a serpent hieroglyph as part of the output. This is because DJ is how the serpent hieroglyph was translated into the English alphabet. For starters, the sound it makes is an onomatopoeia, like hiss, that sounds like the sound a serpent might make, right? What is a lot more interesting is the fact that several words with ties to this hieroglyph have been modified, which to me, I am a conspiracy theorist, and I'm a pretty much all of human history conspiracy theorist at a certain level. We probably don't have time to get that deep into cosmology today, but I would be more than happy to talk about it with you at some point. So first, there's the modern reference, right? The Jedi Order from Star Wars. This was based on the DJEDI, Jedi order of Egyptian priest warriors who understood things like how chi could be cultivated and used for various purposes, even affecting physical matter, what George Lucas scripted into his movies as the Force. For the movies, right, the leading D was dropped, so the J alone would be responsible for the leading sound. This obfuscated the connection to the Jedi, the DJ EDI Jedi, and the DJ Serpent character. I don't know whose call it was to drop that leading D, but I have suspicions, again, based on deeper aspects of my cosmology, on who it was and why they did that. Next, I would present the 3 wise men, the 3 kings, the Magi, who visited the baby Jesus in Bethlehem. The Medjay, that's Medjay, were not just a made-up name of a group of people from Assassin's Creed, right? This is a real group from history. Magi and Medjay are phonetically such a match, it's really hard to draw a hard line between them and say, nope, nothing to see here. These words have zero etymological connection whatsoever. We know that the word magic derives from magi, and if we accept that Medjay, Medjay, is the proper spelling of magi, then a reasonable guess for the original word used to refer to the practices of the Medjay would be Medjaic, Medjaic. I've never really read anything of Aleister Crowley's, but I do know that his spelling of magic with the K on the end was meant to distinguish the practices of the Magi from stage illusions. And I think if presented with this information, he might have agreed that Medjaic, Medjaic, is better than magic with a K on the end. I used to think that when the Kundalini Shakti Prana Serpent activates a man's wisdom chakra, it would make sense to call that, or I tend to think that it would make sense to call that man a wise man, right? Assuming they've activated that wisdom energy center, it, according to my research, serves as a sort of modem, allowing one to tap into divine intelligence for inspiration, let's say. It would make sense that such a person might gain a reputation for wisdom. One might measure and label a man's level of spiritual development with a reference to the highest active chakra. In the case of the man who has activated them all, the reference would be made to the crown chakra, making king such a measurement and label. The biblical magi are spoken of as having been both wise men and kings. So the Medjay, Medjay, were most likely the biblical magi, and the presence of the DJ in the word Medjay indicates a connection to the serpent, Kundalini, which indicates the activation of all the chakras. I think that these were enlightened geniuses, which leads us to the next word, genius, which derives from jinn, D-J-I-N-N, another word that can be spelled with a DJ, but is nowadays often spelled with just a leading J, J-I-N-N. Jinn is most commonly known today as being an Islamic word. However, it is a well-known fact that when a conquest of one people by another takes place, there is some cultural blending that occurs. And given that Egypt existed long before the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, encountered the Archangel Gabriel in that cave, and before Ishmael was ever born of Abraham, I'm pretty confident in asserting that jinn conceptually originated in Egypt, meaning the Islamic take on the concept of jinn is, in my opinion, a distortion of the original intended meaning that, when the word was coined, essentially. I think it's important to look at why the word was coined, when it was coined, why did they say it that way? So, what were they trying to encapsulate with that term? Jinn gives us several interesting words that sort of belong in the same conversation as Jedi masters and the Jedi mind trick and Medjay, who were wise men. Jinn is the etymological forefather of words like genius, genie, engine, engineer, ingenious, and genuine. Again, if we pay attention to the presence of that DJ in Jinn, we get a serpent hieroglyph indicating that Jinn may have been connected to chakra activation. Wisdom chakra and third eye chakra both would make sense for several of these words. Engineers are often touted as geniuses because of their high intellect and their ability to produce engines and other widgets, which are ingenious inventions. In my mind, I spell widget with a J because it's so close to wadjet, and as a concept, the widget belongs next to inventors and engineers, in my opinion. So both the distorted spelling and the meaning of the term make asserting an etymological distortion here very reasonable, in my opinion. You take a look at genies and how they're depicted. Genies are depicted as somewhat gaseous entities, indicating a spiritual nature. In the same way, one might envision how a disembodied ghost might pass through your physical body, or how Flash phases through physical matter. We can understand in a somewhat parallel way by envisioning ourselves walking through a gaseous entity, like how genies are depicted. Part of the reason for this gaseous depiction may be a correct inherited reference from Islam of smokeless fire. People who experience Kundalini awakenings in which the serpent rises and new chakras are activated will often report the event as having been fiery, like electric fire or pins and needles throughout their body. The fire of the Holy Spirit, baptism by fire. These are common things that people talk about. So it's a somewhat varied experience for each person who experiences it. However, there are some typical things that many people do experience, and this tends to be one of them. This is consistent, again, with the Christian parlance typically found around descriptions of being filled with the Holy Spirit, right? So genies are depicted with a human torso and a serpentine tail of sorts that leads back to a magic or magaic lamp. Chakras are sometimes depicted as flowers or even as wheels. Flower petals radiate outward from the center of the flower. Wheel spokes radiate outward from the hub of the wheel. Like wheels and flowers, lamps radiate light and heat outward from themselves, which would make a magic lamp as a symbol of a chakra incredibly fitting, right? So genies weren't always depicted as blue or indigo or purple, but that's how the emojis are. That's how Disney's Aladdin was. There's at least one historical depiction of a blue genie from history that I've seen before. So, I mean, each chakra is associated with a color. Root chakra is red, sacral's orange, etc. So the wisdom chakra is blue, and like the third eye is indigo, purplish, right? So those genie colors would also make sense as a symbolic reference to this. Now, according to my research, the crown chakra is not activated. It's a sort of sum total of the other 6 chakras below it. So anyone who's activated the wisdom chakra or the wisdom and the third eye chakras has opened up a sort of tap into intelligent infinity, if you will. They may experience things like improved intuition, inspiration, or even so-called psychic powers like clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, or claircognizance. Sometimes in the Hindu tradition, these are known as siddhis, S-I-D-D-H-I-S, like powers. Cassandra, the Cassandra complex with Apollo and Troy and all that stuff. She was said to have been clairvoyant, and no one would listen to her warnings as the Greeks were approaching Troy. So let's see. Yeah, such a person might be Nikola Tesla, Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, Srinivasa Ramanujan, etc. Another word with clear etymological ties to jinn is genuine. In order to activate each chakra, certain cosmic lessons must be learned or achieved. So to activate the heart chakra, for example, requires that a person love unconditionally. The golden rule is a good way to pursue this goal, right? When it comes to the wisdom chakra in the throat, however, the spiritual accomplishment involves honesty. It involves speaking truth. It involves treading lightly whenever one might mislead others. It means caveating opinion as opinion, not masquerading opinion as fact. It involves sincerity. These people are genuine. Genuine, jinn, there's your activation to the wisdom chakra. So genies, then, it seems, was a term created to give us a way of talking about honest people who have activated, at the very least, the wisdom chakra, but also potentially the third eye chakra. They do things normies don't understand. Some call it magaic or magic. When we don't understand how a person did something, we're prone to call it magic, right? Magic is related to wonder, literally speaking. So when normies are wondering how this genie invented some incredible invention, the normies are witnessing magaic. And it wasn't just the Egyptians who had interesting symbolism around the serpent. If we look at Greece, their word for serpent is ophis, O-P-H-I-S. If we take the letter that resembles a serpent in that word, the S, and sounds like an S, and we move it from the end of that word to the beginning of that word, we get Sophie, which is the Greek word for wisdom. I don't think that's a coincidence. While we're talking about Greek letters, let's have a look at a few quotes from Revelation. Revelation 1:8 says, quote, I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the ending, saith the Lord, which is and which was and which is to come, the Almighty, end quote. Revelation 21:6 reads, and he said unto me, it is done, I am Alpha and Omega. Revelation 22:13 reads, I am Alpha and Omega, right? The beginning and the end, the first and the last. So Briefly, in the Hindu tradition, Shiva is the representation of what is known as the divine masculine, and Shakti, Kundalini Shakti, the serpent, is known as the divine feminine. These two are the representations of those aspects of the one infinite creator that are penetrative or emissive, right? That is masculine, and that are receptive, that is feminine. Yin and yang are the same. Yin is the divine feminine, yang is the divine masculine. In the teachings of Kabbalah, the Tree of Life you're familiar with, there's a lot of emphasis on the divine feminine and the divine masculine. Certain Sephiroth on the Tree of Life are masculine, things like wisdom, power, and victory. Wisdom is penetrative, power emanates, victory is contagious. Things like understanding, Mercury, and splendor are Sephiroth on the Tree of Life that are feminine. Understanding is learning, which is receptive. Mercy is accepting. Accept and receptive share an etymological connection, the idea of take, right? Splendor is taken in. One takes in the splendor of one's surroundings, admiring the beauty of it and whatnot. So an alternative translation for splendor would be glory. Something glorious is something worthy of splendor, generally speaking. According to multiple sources, Jesus was versed in Kabbalah. One source is a translation of the Lord's Prayer, also known as the Our Father, direct from Aramaic to English that bypasses multiple translations and may offer more signal and less noise. And to a person who's studied Kabbalah and is familiar with common translations of the Sephiroth on the Tree of Life, this variation of this prayer might sound like a covering of the bases, or in this case, a covering of the Sephiroth of the Tree of Life from Kabbalah teachings. The direct from Aramaic to English version of the Lord's Prayer reads as follows: O cosmic birther of all radiance and vibration, soften the ground of our bodies and carve out a space within us where your presence can abide. Fill us with your creativity so that we may be in power to bear the fruit of your mission. Let each of our actions bear fruit in accordance with our desires. Endow us with the wisdom to produce and share what each being needs to grow and flourish. Untie the tangled threads of destiny that bind us as we release others from the entanglement of past mistakes. Do not let us be seduced by that which would divert us from our true purpose that illuminates the opportunities of our present moment. For you are the ground, the truthful mission, the birth, the power, and fulfillment, as all is gathered and made whole again. And so it is. I'm going to read it again, and I've got some sort of annotations in there with references to where I think Sephiroth are being potentially referred to. So again, it reads, O cosmic birther. To me, that may be a reference to Keter, or enlightenment, possibly Binah, or understanding the divine mother. O cosmic birther of all radiance and vibration, soften the ground, that could be Malkuth, or kingdom, from the Tree of Life, of our bodies, and carve out a space within us where your presence can abide, which to me reminds me of Yesod, foundation, the ether that interpenetrates all of physical reality. Fill us with your creativity. Netzach, or victory, may be indicative of creative genius, so that would work there potentially. So that we may be in power. Well, that's a direct reference to Gebura, power, to bear the fruit of your mission. Let each of our actions bear fruit in accordance with our desires. That sounds potentially like victory or power to me. Endow us with the wisdom, again, that's directly Chakma wisdom, to produce and share what each being needs to grow and flourish. To me, that may be mercy to share with others, right? The power to produce and the mercy to share it with those who need it. Certainly those would be divine ways of being, right? Mm-hmm. Endow us with the wisdom, I did that one. Untie the tangled threads of destiny that bind us as we release others from the entanglement of our past mistakes. That speaks to not only mercy, but also karma as a concept. Do not let us be seduced by that which would divert us from our true purpose that illuminates the opportunities of our present moment. That may be Chakma, or wisdom in the form of discernment. Closing it out, for you are the ground, again, that's probably Malkuth, or kingdom. The truthful mission, that may be Doth, or knowledge, also known as the wisdom chakra, or truth, right? The truthful mission. The birth, to me, that may be Binah, understanding, the divine mother, Sephirah. The power, obviously Gebura power, and fulfillment. I'm thinking that could be Netzach victory or Hod glory / splendor, as all is gathered and made whole again. So the other source, by the way, that corroborates that Jesus learned the tree of life is the past life regression hypnosis pioneer in some of her work on Jesus. If we look at the teachings of Kabbalah and the tree of life, we see that the idea that in order to activate the heart chakra, known within the tree of life's nomenclature as Tifereth or beauty, we must embody, balance, and merge within ourselves the divine characteristics of Gebura or power, which is masculine, and Chesed, mercy, which is feminine. This wisdom is actually echoed today in memes on social media. I remember seeing one where person A says to person B, hey, say something profound. Person B is like, it's not virtuous to be harmless, but it is virtuous to be peaceful. The peaceful person is capable of great power. The ability to exercise restraint over that power is virtuous in its mercy. So the peaceful person is doubly virtuous, whereas the harmless person is powerless in the first place. So that's like a Kabbalah teaching, but most people don't even know that if they've ever seen it.
There's a quote in a movie, some random movie that's like that, but yeah.
Wouldn't be surprised. There's so much ancient wisdom floating around in regular like pop culture that people don't realize is ancient wisdom. It's awesome.
Yeah.
So a similar chakra activation triangle is combining chakma or wisdom, which is masculine, which with bina or understanding, which is feminine. The embodiment, balancing, and merger of these divine characteristics unlocks the hidden sephira called Dath. Dath, D-A''ATH, exists in that void between Keter at the top and Tifereth in the middle. Keter at the top is essentially enlightenment. It's kind of a combination of the third eye chakra and the crown chakra. So Dath is a very interesting word, especially given how we started discussing reincarnation. And especially the Christian tradition, the term born again is a thing. I remember learning the term metanoia in a Christian religious context in my schooling, which basically means to change one's mind or to repent. And psychologically, this describes a fundamental change in the human personality. Then you have the commonly heard term salvation. Salvation etymologically it's a process by which a solute is dissolved in a solvent, forming a solution. This idea resonates with the uniting of the divine masculine, solute, penetrative, with the divine feminine, solvent, receptive, to create a child of God, a solution. This idea also resonates with a concept people talk about as being an after effect of Kundalini awakening, that is, of chakra activation. They call it the dark night of the soul. I word it as the period of time after a Kundalini awakening in which one is stripped of that which one never truly was. As a quick personal note on this, my dark night of the soul phase lasted from September in 2018 to January of 2023, in my opinion. And during that time, I dealt with a rash of difficulties, including vehicle problems, job stress. I got burned out, love life problems, other relationship problems, deaths, and more. It was a gauntlet. And one thing that I dropped almost immediately was my 15+ year long obsession with professional and fantasy sports. I was obsessed with that stuff for years. I built spreadsheets. I geeked out. I'd stay up till 3 a.m. keeping track of stats. It was kind of ridiculous. I remember in college thinking about how, again, epistemological solipsism was something I had a hard time refuting, and it really hit me hard. And it was at that same time that I picked up this habit of like obsessively paying attention to sports. And it was something I could pay attention to year round. So it would keep me distracted from these bigger questions, but that was never really me. And I dropped that like a hot potato in the first year. Didn't even care anymore. I used to have alarms set on my phone for East, Central, and West Coast baseball games starting so I could check my rosters. I was obsessed with it. So back to Dath. So we have Dath, which clearly sounds like it has a very strong case to be made as being the etymological source of our word death. when we think about the ideas of born again, metanoia, the dark side of the soul, salvation, and like the phoenix that rises out of its own ashes, it seems clear to me that when the throat chakra is activated, it has a profound change on the person in very significant ways, almost so much as to suggest that the old them is dead and a new version of them is with us now. So doth means knowledge. It's not, knowledge is etymologically connected to gnosis. Gnosis in the esoteric religious sense basically means esoteric knowledge of spiritual truth or mystical knowledge based on direct experience of the divine. Therefore, it's fair to say that gnosis is a label for the same thing doth describes, and both of those are labels describing Vishuddha, the label for the wisdom or throat chakra in Hindu nomenclature. These concepts, again, map across multiple traditions. Speaking of maps, Knossos, pretty obvious connection to gnosis, right?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that the island where Daedalus trapped the Minotaur in the labyrinth?
I don't know. If that's what you're saying, I believe you.
I think it is. That's what my research yielded. Daedalus was a genius, right? A genius derives from Jinn. Jinn is related to the wisdom chakra, Vishuddha, doth, gnosis, right? So if Daedalus the genius had achieved gnosis, perhaps Knossos was named in acknowledgement of that. Likewise, going back to the Jedi thing and the DJ, EDI, and the Star Wars stuff, Sith, that's probably Set, right? And then you've got the Death Star, which was the big weapon of the dark side, right? The evil polarization.
Mm-hmm.
And it was created in the orbit of Geonosis. Sounds a lot like Gnosis, doesn't it?
Yeah, okay.
So if you check one other thing, the DJ, the serpent hieroglyph, when you say that, it sounds an awful lot like a lightsaber firing up.
Yeah.
Just I think Lucas knew a lot about this stuff when he wrote the Star Wars stuff. I think there's a lot of reasonably undistorted cosmology that's baked into that fiction, but like I think a lot of it is very legitimate. So back to those quotes from Revelation then about Alpha and Omega that started on a Greek alphabet thing, right? So as I just showed, even a simple chemical solution can serve as symbolism for the divine masculine and the divine feminine, right? Solute, solvent, and solution. We already know that the serpent of prana or chi wrapped 3.5 times around the root chakra, coiled up, is known in the Hindu tradition as Kundalini Shakti and is considered to be the divine feminine. Shiva, the divine masculine, is considered to be in the crown chakra. So we already have one tradition indicating that the serpent is a symbol of the divine feminine. Then there's the Temple of the Moon that Graham showed on season 2 in Peru that bears a serpent. The moon is associated with the divine feminine in astrology. So it's not at all surprising to me that there's a serpent at that place. If you flip Omega upside down, you get essentially the Om symbol, which is not only significant from like the meditation mantra vantage point, it could reasonably be described as a serpent with its belly on the ground, its tail up, and its head up. If you flip Alpha upside down, you get a bull's head with the horns protruding upwards and a downward pointing triangular face and snout. If you're a bit sloppy with the crossbar on the A, on the Alpha, you might even give the bull a couple of little ears. The bull's horns are penetrative. The bull charges forward, leading with its head, confident in its power. This is embodied by top warriors who lead the charge into battle, confident in their martial prowess. Think Achilles in Troy, right? Think Ajax. The bull is symbolic of the divine masculine for all of these reasons. To declare that one is the Alpha and the Omega is to declare that one is the bull and the serpent, Shiva and Shakti, yin and yang, the divine masculine and the divine feminine, embodied, balanced, and united within one's mind, body, and spirit. But what about the whole last thing, right? So that's in there. If we map Alpha and Omega to the Hebrew or Phoenician alphabet, one might be tempted to map Alpha to Aleph, which I agree with, that makes perfect sense, and omega to tav, because they are the first and last letters in that alphabet, like alpha and omega are in the Greek alphabet. That would be a mistake, though, in my opinion. I think, again, alpha maps to aleph, but omega, I think, maps to teth, the 9th letter of the Hebrew Phoenician alphabet, which happens to be a numerical alphabet in which the first 10 letters were also used as numbers, making aleph 1, or first, and teth 9, the last single-digit number before the 10th letter, ayin, indicating 10. So what happens when we merge or add aleph with teth? 1 plus 9 is 10. We get completion of the unit, the base unit of the system, and we get ascendance from the singles position to the next level, the tens position, analogous to ascension to heavenly realms, or what have you, in your, whatever traditions parlance we want to think in. So with this in mind, the first last teachings remain, but we pick up important meaning, especially when you realize that one of the many literal meanings for teth, besides 9, is serpent. Also, it represents the letter T. Make the T sound and extend it. What do you get? A serpent onomatopoeia. So not only that, but just like omega upside down, teth looks just like a serpent with its belly on the ground, its head up, and its tail up. The Arabic letter ba is exactly the same as omega upside down and teth. They all resemble serpents with the belly on the ground, the head and the tail up. So you have ka ba la and mer ka ba. Both have ka and ba in them for good reason. Both are about merging the divine feminine, the serpent, ba, with the divine masculine, the bull, ka. So with all that said, when we hear Jesus say in Matthew 10:16 to the disciples, quote, "Behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves," end quote. Jesus is acknowledging that heresy hunters are hungry for heretics to eat for dinner. And Jesus knows that the Pharisees and their acolytes and followers view Jesus' teachings as undermining them, as a threat to them. He highlights their hypocrisies. They're attached to their hypocrisies, though, so they experience cognitive dissonance and don't like that. They would simply prefer that he and his disciples and followers just go away. These are the wolves out there seeking to eat some sheep for dinner he was warning of. The serpent and dove statements had everything to do with activating the wisdom chakra and achieving enlightenment. Again, the dove being a bird is a symbol of enlightenment insofar as birds fly, and mythologically speaking, at least, are lighter than air. Obviously, I know birds aren't lighter than air, but it's still kind of valid symbolism because at some point in the past, people thought that was probably true. So obviously the dove being white and a symbol of lightness in terms of like density and weight and whatnot is an even stronger homage to enlightenment, Keter, Sufi light, etc. For some, the idea that Jesus instructed the disciples to embody the wisdom of the serpent may seem off-putting given the negative connotation of the serpent in the Garden of Eden story. I contest that connotation. While I have ample cause to think that Lucifer indeed had a very significant role to play in that story,
Cleveland.
A thing went off on my phone there for half a second.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the serpent in Genesis 3 was not a symbol of Lucifer. This is one place where I will disagree with Chan Thomas, which is kind of funny because the Adam and Eve story is the main title of his book. The serpent in Genesis 3 is the same serpent spoken of by Jesus in Matthew 10:16. It's the same as Kundalini Shakti. In that story, Adam and Eve achieved self-awareness, which is the spiritual accomplishment associated with the activation of the solar plexus chakra. This is what happens to puppies when they're about 5 weeks old and they're being trained. People call it imprinting, but it's really an activation of self-awareness as a result of being given choices to obey or disobey during the training process. It's the result of being given a name and a place to be, and this is my bowl, and this is where I lay down, and this particular vibratory sound complex is always used when he's looking at me, and it's all this activation of a self and self-awareness involved in that process. I think this is what happened to Adam and Eve. There were no self-aware animals developing on the earth. So to catalyze that growth, Adam and Eve were given a choice to obey or disobey regarding the fruit of that one tree.
bots don't get credit for their actions. The creators of the bot get the credit. Bots don't own the product of their labor. The owner of the bot gets the product of the bot's labor. NPCs, if you will, do not get credit for their actions because they're just regurgitating canned lines. The 2021 Ryan Reynolds movie, Free Guy, was essentially this exact sort of plot line. NPC becomes self-aware. I don't want to suggest that the term NPC used to politically sling mud is true, by the way. My cosmology is such that all human beings have activated the bottom 3 chakras, but animals have only the bottom 2 active. So when an animal spends a lot of time with humans, especially in captivity or as pets, they wind up realizing that they are a self. And when they die a physical death, I think they'll reincarnate into a human form as a first round human with perhaps the lowest level of self-awareness, that may exist on a spectrum as we reincarnate through incarnations and grow and develop spiritually speaking. So I think that we're all self-aware, but some people may be a lot more self-aware or conscientious than others. And like Big 5 personality testing would, I think, verify that. So the serpent's presence, and I'm close to done here. I know we've been going for a while, but so the serpent's presence in that story, I think, was symbolic of the activation of a chakra, in that case, the solar plexus chakra. And it makes sense for the solar plexus chakra to be associated with self-awareness. As I said before, in order for someone to get credit for their choices, they must know that they are a self that has agency and is capable of making choices. Humans are self-aware, and we do have a choice to make. As I said before, we can polarize towards love, service to others, and fully activating our heart chakra, or we can polarize towards domination and control, service to the self, and fully deactivating our heart chakras. And in order to polarize in one direction or the other, we must first know that we are a self. We must be self-aware. So finishing out a few more serpent connections, I have to mention the obvious stories of the feathered serpents, Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan. Then we have the fact that the word dragon derives etymologically from serpent. Dragons and feathered serpents both have serpentine forms with feathers or wings to them. This echoes the caduceus symbolism as well as the phoenix, not to mention the raptor bird versus serpent symbolism seen in many places. So that's kind of my spiel on the serpent symbolism. I've got about, I don't know, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes at most on megaliths. Cover that real quick. And at that point, I'm pretty much out for what I was planning on trying to cover with you here today. Obviously, I have a lot I can rant about, but maybe that's best saved for another time.
Yeah. Let's keep it to a concise topic and end it there then. Do you have anything conclusion that you'd like to say, or is that good?
I've got like less than 1 page of notes to offer on megaliths. I think that would perhaps be of interest, like pyramids and Cusco and all that. Like, so
all right, go ahead.
All right, there's a guy on X right now, Marcel Foti at
yes,
Fomahan.
I know him.
Okay,
yeah.
so you know of him. I think that is perhaps the obvious answer to megaliths. I don't know how many of them it kind of solves or answers, but I actually do have one of his little Moai statues here. Where is it?
Yeah, and he does that's from him specifically?
Yep, that's one of his.
Oh, does he sell those?
Yep. He also sells Sword in the Stones and something else on his, I think it's Buy Me a Coffee.
That's a smart idea for him to do. Yeah, and he does what's the name for it? It's
Geopolymers.
Geopolymers, right?
Yep.
It's
so readily available.
It's pretty crazy.
Out of primitive materials too, and he's got like a map too that co-locates natron support like sources to megalithic sites worldwide, and he shows that natron deposits exist within a reasonable distance for resource gathering from many megalithic sites worldwide. So I don't know how many of those sites are answered by his work, but I find it compelling and promising and heavily based in science, and I think it's awesome. So
Yeah, I mean, he displays that it's possible at the very least. Now that scale can be something that's, you know, a separate conversation, but at the same time, when we're talking about megaliths that people have different theories for, but we can't really know for sure how they were built. I think Occam's razor would say that the most reasonable explanation, like if we're talking about moving 2,000-ton stone blocks, it probably seems like scaling geopolymer creation of the blocks in place is very likely a more likely solution. I haven't seen any arguments against it, rather than, you know, I think it's mostly just ignored by academics. I haven't that might not be true. I'd be interested to see anything from an academic on it, but so far I haven't.
and actually the Moai statues themselves, in my opinion, may lend significant credibility to the idea that Mu once was a continent that encompassed Easter Island, Hawaii, and or Fiji Islands. Because if you like, how much economic surplus of like effort of manpower would a civilization have to afford a workforce to work on those projects? Right, it would have had to, like, does Rapa Nui honestly have the square mileage to support the size of a civilization that could dedicate significant amounts of effort to creating those things?
I'm not sure.
I don't think it could. I think they would have needed much larger supply chains to support a population that could afford to have, like, how many people in a primitive society can afford to, you know, I don't know, twiddle their fingers all day and just waste their time? Look, if we assume that making these megaliths, it was some sort of gigantic waste of time, which I don't, but like, if you were to equate that, how could they afford to just do that? They have to,
Right.
they have to survive. They have to subsist. They have to,
It's not labor that's associated with direct subsistence, but I don't know. I think that Rapa Nui had a carrying capacity of at least a few thousand people, maybe tens of thousands,
Okay,
and over a long enough period of time. I'm not sure. I'm just not sure.
right. It's a thought to consider. You may be right. I don't know it. I'm glad you said that, because
Yeah.
I'm not confident in that. It's just, like I said, part of my hip shot theory of where I'm at with all.
Yeah, and there is also that fishing. Not that fishing is the only thing that the Polynesians use to subsist, but fishing is very efficient as a form of gathering substance.
Yeah,
And that's why you have, like, ostensibly hunter gatherers in the Pacific Northwest who are able to be quite advanced compared to other hunter gatherers. Anthropologists consider fishers as hunter gatherers, while I think they should probably be in their own category, because they're very different. But the socio-political complexity of fishermen is relatively high compared to their technology needed to do what they do.
I would buy that. That there, I know there's plenty of land. I don't know how much. I'm not, you know, as trained on that stuff. But to me, it seemed like at least an interesting question, because this island, it's in the middle of nowhere. It seems.
There's also the possibility of Rapa Nui being a pilgrimage site where people came from other places
True.
towards it, which is my own personal pet theory based on a few things that I haven't completely fleshed out and likely never will, unless it becomes an area that people have a lot of interest in. And also, there's limited information on it to prove that, but it's very circumstantial evidence.
And like I said, a lot of the stuff that I've talked about, I've got perhaps controversial pieces of evidence. Like I am digging into the woo-woo stuff, obviously, and into the spiritual side of things, but I think a lot of it matches up in ways that I personally have trouble refuting in a devil's advocacy, playing chess against yourself kind of way.
Yeah, yeah. All right. So, what would you like to promote? What do you want me to put in the description, and where do you want me to send people for people to find you?
I'm on X at redtailhawk1923. I'm maybe shin deep, knee deep in writing a book about all of this stuff. I still have plenty of deeper research to continue to do, and I have absolutely no idea when any such book would be ready. I've got 5 chapters written up already, and I think I've got about 25 that I'm planning on diving into. The title of the book is What's in a Name, a play off of the Shakespeare Romeo and Juliet thing, because all of this started because Medicine Man gave me my name and I had to start going down this rabbit hole trying to figure out how things made sense, and it's led me here. So
Okay, very cool. All right, well, thank you for coming, thank you for sharing all that, and yeah, we'll talk again soon.
Right on. Thank you for having me.